Chapter 80. The Mid-Autumn Festival had always been a very elegant festival since ancient times. An incense burner table was set up in the courtyard, and on it were some fruits, pastries, mooncakes, snacks, and the like. 3 cups of light wine and 2 plates of side dishes would be gathered with the family, and they would toast to the moon. However, any kind of elegant atmosphere would always be destroyed when it came to Fong and the others. Even if it was as elegant as the Mid-Autumn Festival, it would also become unbearably vulgar. The sky was not dark yet, and a huge shed had been set up in the open space in front of Fong's house. Inside the shed, a huge pot was bubbling with hot steam. Fong stood on the table next to it, waving a huge spatula in his hand and stirring it with all his might. Inside the pot was half a fan of fresh pork that they had just bought today, and some spare ribs. The fragrance of the meat permeated the air, and it could be smelled from afar. Originally, they had planned to buy a whole pig, but after asking the price, Fong and the others discussed it, and they still bought half a fan of pork together. They had just gotten out of poverty, and they wanted to save as much as possible. A few naughty children lingered outside the shed, and their eyes were fixed on the big pot, and their mouths kept swallowing saliva. Inside the shed, a few men sat around the table, and there were several freshly fried side dishes on the table. They picked up the muddy wine in the bowl, and drank it all in one gulp. From time to time, there would be hearty laughter. "Fong, let the wife at home take care of the meat. Come over and drink with us." A strong man put down the wine bowl, looked in Fong's direction, and said loudly, "You guys drink first, I'll be right there." Fong replied, but he did not put down the huge spatula in his hand. A trace of doubt appeared on the man's face, and he muttered to himself, "What's wrong with Fong today? He usually runs faster than anyone else when he drinks, but he hasn't touched a single drop of wine today." A little further away, Fong wiped the sweat from his forehead, and he made up his mind that he would not go there tonight even if he died. Last time, he drank a bowl of wine from his son-in-law, and it made him lie in bed for a whole day. When he woke up, his head was so painful that it felt like it was going to explode. Thinking of that feeling, even though Fong was a man of indomitable spirit, he could not help but feel a little scared. He would not touch wine for a while. After a while, seeing that the meat in the pot was almost done cooking, old Fong waved his hand and called for everyone to come over. He filled everyone's bowl with a full bowl of meat soup, and naturally, there was no lack of meat. When he turned around and saw a few naughty kids pacing back and forth outside, he called out to them from afar and waved them in. Every naughty kid got a bowl of soup. Although these children were the direct descendants of the Liu family, the grievances between the adults had nothing to do with the children. Fong was still very clear about this point. The few naughty children did not have time to say thank you when they got the benefits. They picked up the bowls and ran to the side. The boiling hot meat soup made them suck in air. They stretched out their dirty claws and took out a bone that had been cooked to crisp from the bowl. After tearing off the shredded meat on it, they ate it, and even bit the bone to swallow it. These days, no family had a good time. Even the direct descendants of the Liu family could not eat meat whenever they wanted. In today's village, only the Li family, Fong, and the others could live such a comfortable life. The candied Ha's business had long been stabilized, and there was a lot of income every day. Although Fong and the others did not eat so extravagantly, it was a bit unreasonable if they did not reward themselves during the festival. The Willow Leaf village was not small, but it was not too big either. The shed was open, and there was such a big pot of meat being cooked. The smell could almost fill the entire village. Some people stood at the door of their houses and looked over with envious eyes. They could not help but gulp when they smelled the smell of the meat. Among these people, there was no lack of direct descendants of the Liu family. "Do you think we should apologize to Rui and the others?" Looking at the bustling scene as if it was New Year's Eve, a middle-aged man turned to look at another man beside him and said hesitantly, "Apologize for what?" The man was stunned and asked. "We have been too harsh to them in the past." The middle-aged man said with a complicated expression, "We are all uncles. You can put your face down, but I can't." The man's expression changed and immediately said, "Face is nothing. Look at the Fong family now. They have meat to eat and wine to drink. Their lives are much better than ours. The expression on the middle-aged man's face was very envious. He continued, I've asked around. Their candied haws business has a daily income. That's a lot of money. If we can also sell candied haws. Recently, the most uncomfortable thing for the Lu family was to find that the people they had never looked at before were all living better lives than them. They could drink big bowls of wine and eat big mouthfuls of meat, while they could not even drink soup. As for comparing with Lu Rui and the others, these people had never thought about it. According to Madame Wu, every time Rui's son-in-law came back, he would bring a few hundred taels of silver with him. Those silver ingots were as big as a fist. It's not like you don't know that the secret recipe of the candied haws is in their hands. Now in the prefectural city, those people only recognize them for the candied haws business. We can't get involved at all, unless they agree. If Rui agrees, it will work. I'm not going to ask you to beg her. After saying this, the man flicked his sleeves and left. The middle-aged man stood there and sighed. He murmured, I really can't bring myself to do this. Why don't I talk to second granduncle first? Second granduncle's words, Rui should listen to him. He stood there in a daze for a long time. Just as he was about to turn around and go home, he suddenly saw the man come out of the house with something in his arms and hurriedly walk forward. Where are you going? The middle-aged man asked casually. It's not easy for Rui and her sister all these years. There are still a dozen eggs left at home. I'm going to send them to nourish their bodies. The man's voice came from the dark night. The figure gradually walked away, leaving the middle-aged man standing there with a stunned expression, alone in the night wind. In the small courtyard, Li Yi was explaining to Xiao Huan and sister Rui that there was no Chang Yi, no osmanthus tree, no Wu Gang, and of course, no jade rabbit on the moon. The courtyard they were in was hundreds of thousands of miles away from the moon. The moon itself did not emit light. The moonlight they were seeing now was actually sunlight. The little servant girl never doubted Li Yi's words. After listening to him, she was obviously a little sad that Chang Yi and Jade Rabbit were not on the moon. Lu Rui had never believed that there was Chang Yi and Jade Rabbit on the moon. That was something that only young girls believed in. However, she was skeptical of Li Yi's words that the moon did not emit light and what they were seeing now was actually sunlight. It was not that she did not believe it at all. Although this sounded a little unbelievable, compared to this, Lu Rui felt that it was even more unbelievable that two rocks of different sizes would fall from the same height and land at the same time. Since such a thing could happen, what else was impossible? As for Lu Rui, she only listened quietly. Although she also had doubts in her heart, she did not ask. She patiently waited for Li Yi's explanation. Li Yi was just about to explain to them the principle of the moon reflecting sunlight when there was a sudden knock on the door. Just now, it was eggs and mooncakes. What is it this time? A puzzled expression appeared on his face. He was greatly surprised. Could it be that this world had a tradition of sending warmth during the Mid-Autumn Festival? Chapter 81. Even if there was a tradition of sending warmth to the Mid-Autumn Festival in this world, it shouldn't be the direct descendants of the Lu family who still had grudges with them. Li Yi remembered that when he first came to the village, these people didn't need to look at him directly. But just now, they deliberately flattered him, which made him feel comfortable. Since they came with gifts, Li Yi naturally could not put on a cold face. No matter what they brought, he accepted it all. And when the other party was hesitating as if he wanted to say something, he smiled and asked Xiao Huan to send them off. Li Yi naturally knew what they were thinking. Seeing that Fong and the others were living better and better lives, it would be strange if these people didn't envy them. However, if they didn't spit out all the things they ate from Sister Rui these years, there was no room for negotiation. Li Yi's attitude also made these people realize that it was impossible to get the benefits they wanted with just a few eggs, a few mooncakes, or a few words of apology. They needed to show more sincerity. For the people of the Lu family who were sad for Lu's sister Rui, there was not a moment when they regretted more than now. What they lost now was far more than what they took from the two sisters. It was not easy to popularize modern scientific knowledge to the people of this era. Some principles could be explained through simple experiments, but things that were not easy to verify were not so easy to accept. For example, whether it was Lu's sister Rui or Xiao Huan, they couldn't understand what Li Yi said. They started from Willow Village and kept walking forward, and one day they would return to the village. When Li Yi used a big ball as a metaphor for the world they lived in, even the little servant girl couldn't help laughing. "Young master, if we live on a big ball, then won't the people living below fall down?" Even the little servant girl who trusted Li Yi to the extreme couldn't understand this matter. Speaking of this, Li Yi realized that it was time to end the knowledge popularization tonight. If he continued to explain, he might have to talk about gravity or the rotation of the Earth. Was the planet under their feet called the Earth? This was something that Li Yi could not prove. But here, all the natural laws of the original world were also applicable. The sunrise and sunset, the 24 hours of the day, the 24 solar terms, and other aspects should be the same. It was somewhat similar to the parallel space theory of the future, but whether it was true or not was no longer important to him. After dinner, he walked out of the courtyard. When he reached the door, he smelled the fragrance of meat that had yet to dissipate. Fang and those fellows were too high profile. With such great fanfare, were they not afraid of attracting the wolves in the back mountain? Speaking of which, it was the night of the full moon. The possibility of this happening was very high. He had to remind Xiao Huan to close the door at night. As he thought of this, he saw a few sturdy figures walking over. Son-in-law. Fang was quite surprised to meet Li Yi and immediately greeted him. "Where are you going?" Li Yi asked curiously. "We plan to go down the mountain tonight and walk around the prefectural city," Fang replied with a smile. "It's so late, going to the prefectural city?" Li Yi was even more puzzled. Seeing Fang and the others sneaking around, the smiles on their faces seemed to reveal a sense of lasciviousness. Li Yi looked at them and said, "Could it be that you are going to a brothel?" The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it was possible. Fang looked honest, but he was always thinking about earning money to marry a mistress. He was the type of person who was extremely coquettish on the inside. But the strange thing was that he was not afraid of his wife at home today. Fang looked at Li Yi and said righteously, "Son-in-law, the prefectural city is very lively on the night of the Mid-Autumn Festival. We are just going down the mountain to take a look. Son-in-law, don't sully our innocence." Fang's words made Li Yi want to slap him. He was clearly uncultured, but he still wanted to learn from scholars and speak in a genteel manner. Yet, he always expressed the wrong meaning, sully his innocence. This scene stung his eyes just thinking about it. Moreover, where did this guy get his innocence from? We are all men, so I can understand. But this kind of thing needs to be restrained. Don't be carried out of the jade yard tomorrow. Although Fang looked like a dragon and a tiger, who knew if he was as strong as he looked in that aspect? Li Yi kindly reminded him. "Son-in-law, how do you know about the jade yard?" Fang looked at Li Yi and asked with a puzzled expression. Li Yi was stunned for a moment, then a smile appeared on his face. He looked up at the sky and couldn't help but exclaim, "The moon tonight is not bad. The moon is so big and round." Fang, after being stunned for a moment, he could only laugh dryly and say, "Yes, the moon is so big and round today." He sighed with emotion at the mid-autumn moon and suddenly felt a surge of talent in his heart. He almost wanted to recite a poem, but Fang stopped himself in time. He turned to look at Li Yi and said, "Son-in-law, do you want to go down with us to take a look? The busiest days of the year in the prefectural city are the mid-autumn and the upper prime period. Don't worry, if you want to go to the jade yard, we will definitely not tell eldest miss when we come back." Fang and the others looked at each other and revealed a smile that all men understood. To be honest, Li Yi was really moved by Fang's words. In this era, one couldn't watch TV or watch movies, or even play with mobile phones. There was really no entertainment to pass the time. It was even more so in the stockade outside the prefectural city. After dark, people could only go to bed early. Li Yi was very curious about what the nightlife of the people in the city was like. On account of old Fang's sincere invitation, he reluctantly accompanied them for a stroll. Of course, it was fine to go to the jade yard. It was the first time in 2 lifetimes, and he couldn't give it away so carelessly. Moreover, he and Zheng Zumo were considered acquaintances. If he ran into her, how awkward would it be? He could consider going to other brothels. Under the condition of keeping his bottom line, he could properly experience the ancient culture. Going out with Fang and the others in the middle of the night, his sense of security suddenly increased a lot. He was about to go back and say hello to Lu Rui and the others, but when he turned around, he found that the woman with the sword was leaning against a willow tree behind him, looking at them with interest. "Hello, second miss." Fang had an extremely simple and honest expression on his face. He greeted Lu Rui, but there was a trace of an imperceptible smirk at the corner of his mouth. Seeing his sister-in-law behind him, Li Yi suddenly had a few black lines on his face. He had actually been tricked by this idiot Fang. He must have remembered that he had been beaten up by his sister-in-law 2 times before. He had already seen Lu Rui just now and deliberately said those words to lure him. Was this still the King simple and honest Fang? Chapter 82. After seeing the Qing and Prefecture city on the night of the Mid-Autumn Festival, Li Yi finally understood that Fang was right. Before this, he had never thought that the nightlife of the ancient people could be so rich. The streets of the Qing and Prefecture city were as lively as the extremely prosperous night markets of the later generations. The entire street was brightly lit, and the main street, which was several feet wide, was unusually crowded. It was difficult for carriages and horses to move. There was an endless stream of pedestrians, and hawkers with their shoulders on their shoulders came and went. All kinds of hawking sounds could be heard. After walking for a short distance, Li Yi already saw a few hawkers selling candied haws. Their business was unusually good. If Fang and the others saw this, they would probably die of heartache. Tonight's business was probably equivalent to 10 days or half a month's worth of business. Thinking of Fang, Li Yi couldn't help but feel a few black lines appear on his face. Men become bad when they become rich. This saying was used in both ancient and modern times. Now that Fang's wallet was bulging, even his personality had changed a lot. Who knew where the honest man who couldn't bear to eat the pheasant he hunted and wanted to give it to Lu's sister Rui had gone? In such a short period of time, he had become a sinister, cunning, and shameless person. Li Yi turned to look at Rui, who was following him and looking at the night market with interest. In his heart, he had already made up his mind to let Fang do the most difficult and tiring work for a period of time in the future. If it wasn't for Fang, the current him would probably be free and unfettered. Perhaps he could really go to a brothel and experience the splendid culture of the ancient times. Of course, this was just an assumption. Although it was a little exciting to bring his sister-in-law to a brothel, before this, Li Yi couldn't guarantee that Lu Rui wouldn't put his sword in a wrong place. Fang and the others were clever. The moment they entered the prefecture city, they found an excuse to slip away, leaving this big trouble to Li Yi. Of course, Li Yi also rejected this in his heart. However, ever since they entered the city, Lu Rui had been following behind him without any intention of leaving. He couldn't get rid of him no matter what. "Rui, why don't I give you a few taels of silver, and you can walk around by yourself?" The feeling of being watched by others did not feel good. Li Yi finally could not hold it in any longer. He turned his head to look at Lu Rui and gave a very constructive suggestion. Lu Rui turned her head to look at him. There was no expression on her face, nor did she speak. However, the look in her eyes made Li Yi feel a little diffident. Moments later, Li Yi waved his hand helplessly. "Forget it. Follow me if you want to." With such a tough sister-in-law around, it would be impossible to experience the brothel culture with a learning attitude. Li Yi gave up on this idea and walked along the street in boredom. Only the street sideshow could pique his interest. Just when he was about to go over to take a look, someone suddenly patted his back. Li Yi turned his head and was slightly taken aback. A look of surprise appeared on his face. "Brother Li, it's really you." Seeing Li Yi here, the handsome young man opposite him was also very surprised and said with a slightly surprised tone, "Little Huh, brotherly, what a coincidence. Li Yi didn't expect to meet the little prince of Ning Wang Mansion here. He had just said one word when he remembered that he had told others not to call him that, so he changed his words. This lady is Brother Li's wife? The little prince, Li Xian, looked around and saw Lu Rui standing at the side. A trace of surprise flashed in his eyes and he blurted out. No, Brother Li has misunderstood. This is my wife's sister. Li Yi immediately explained. Whoever married Lu Rui was really tired of living. He wasn't that stupid. Wife's sister? Li Xian heard it and was stunned at first. Then, a strange smile appeared on his face. He looked at Li Yi with a look that all men understood. He then patted his shoulder and said, Brother Li is really capable. I admire you. Li Yi was stunned for a while before he understood Li Xian's meaning. When he looked at him again, the look in his eyes changed. This guy. Is he really a little prince? Or, were all the little princes of ancient times this kind of filthy people? Lu Rui didn't understand Li Xian's words at first. But seeing the expression on his face, she seemed to have thought of something. Her pretty face turned cold and one hand was already on the hilt of her sword. A faint murderous aura emanated from her delicate body. At the same time, the expressions of the two men dressed as manservants standing behind Li Xian suddenly changed. They took a step forward and stood in front of Li Xian, reaching for their waists. What are you doing? Li Xian looked at the two people who suddenly became nervous and asked in confusion. The murderous aura collided and swords were drawn. Seeing this, Li Yi's heart skipped a beat. This little prince could flirt with anyone, but he actually flirted with this demoness. If he really angered her, she would chop him like a tree trunk. That night in Qing and prefecture would be very lively. From then on, he could only flee to the ends of the world with the two sisters and Xiao Huan. They would find a hidden place to hide for the rest of their lives. The three of them would live together. Thinking about it, this kind of life seemed to be quite happy. No, if they ran away, Fang and all the people in Willow Leaf Village would not be able to run away. At that time, they might become the scapegoats. After all, murder was a serious crime, not to mention that it was a relative of the emperor. The consequences of this sword were too serious. Before Lu Rui drew out her sword, Li Yi quickly pressed her hand. Don't be impulsive, don't be impulsive. We are all on the same side. Lu Rui's delicate body shook. She looked down at the hand held by Li Yi, and her eyes emitted a dangerous aura again. At this time, the way Li Xian looked at Li Yi was even more different. Although they all had the surname Li, this brother Li's behavior was obviously more eccentric. He had touched his sister-in-law's hand in the street, and he still said that there was no adultery between them. But this matter was soon forgotten by him. He pulled Li Yi's sleeve and said, Let's not talk about this first. Let's go, I will take you to a fun place. Hearing Li Xian said fun place, Li Yi immediately thought of something. He looked serious and said righteously, Brother Li, who do you think I am? How can I go to that kind of place of prostitution? When he spoke, he secretly glanced at Lu Rui, and the awe-inspiring qi on his body became stronger. Brother Li, you misunderstood. This time we are not going to the Jade Yard. You will know the specific place in a while. Li Xian explained. Alas, what a stupid teammate. Feeling two cold eyes falling on his back, Li Yi sighed in his heart and thought with great melancholy. He had been cheated twice in a row. He was afraid that he could no longer avoid going to the Jade Yard. Chapter 83. The lights that lit up the entire night reflected the extreme prosperity of the prefectural city on the night of mid-autumn. No matter where one went, there was a bustling and noisy atmosphere. Somewhere in the bustling area of the city, there was a vast and luxurious manor. Scholars and scholars with feather fans and silk handkerchiefs floated in the wind. As they chatted and laughed, new poems flowed out. After a few paper rafts were sent out, not long after, there were professional singers in the garden. Very quickly, they would sing the poem in a mellow voice and leave it for everyone to judge. On the opposite side, there were all women. They were all the daughters of the large families in the prefectural city. Occasionally, they would sneak a glance across and cover their handkerchiefs with a light smile. They would sneak a glance at the scholars they liked. If a paper raft with a poem was sent over, a few of them would gather together and comment on it. As the daughters of families with a bit of status in the city, they generally knew a bit of poetry. At this time, in a pavilion in a remote corner of the garden, the atmosphere was slightly cold. A young girl of 16 or 17 sat at a stone table in the pavilion with one hand propping up her chin. She looked at the figures coming and going in front of her. Her expression was a bit bored. After a while, she turned her head and said to the women in the pavilion, "This mid-autumn poetry meet is not fun at all." Hearing this, the women looked at each other speechlessly. Today, this garden was hosting the mid-autumn poetry meet, not the mid-autumn temple fair. Even if they randomly stopped anyone on the road, they could be a famous scholar in Qing and prefecture. Everyone was here to exchange pointers and make friends through literature, not to have fun. If a scholar was not famous enough, he wouldn't even have the right to participate in the poetry meet. This invitation from the Uniying Poetry Society had been obtained after many twists and turns. "Sister Yunro, is the scholar you were talking about coming tonight?" The young girl who spoke was not a member of the Uniying Poetry Society. She had only asked Zhao Yunru to bring her to watch because there was an extra invitation. However, reality was different from what she had imagined. This mid-autumn poetry meet was not as fun as she had imagined. She asked Zhao Yunru, still thinking about a certain scholar that her sisters could not forget. Zhao Yunru shook her head with a bitter smile. They never had much hope that they would be able to see Li Yi from the Immortal Magpie Bridge here. Participating in this kind of poetry gathering was probably just an opportunity to broaden their horizons. As expected, the young master from yesterday did not come today, one of the young girls in the pavilion said. Putting aside the scholar who only existed in legends, the nameless scholar who had helped them qualify for the poetry meet yesterday was not seen either. That young master must really be indifferent to fame and fortune. He didn't even accept the invitation yesterday. "It seems that he has no interest in this poetry meet," Wan Ruoqing said after thinking for a while. Until now, she still felt a little regretful that she had forgotten to ask for the young master's name yesterday. With the other's talent in poetry, he was definitely not a nameless person in Qing and Fu. However, after Wan Ruoqing investigated each and every one of the scholars who were worthy of that level of talent, she still did not find any. He was like Li Yi of Immortal Magpie Bridge. He had only left behind poems, but he was nowhere to be seen. This caused countless scholars to daydream. If he could come, perhaps things would not be so boring right now. At least in name, he was still a member of the Uniying Poetry Society. In today's poetry meet, the position of the Uniying Poetry Society was actually quite awkward. Even though they all had the reputation of being talented, there was still a large gap between them and the upper-class scholars. They had no way of fitting into their circle. Even the prefectural magistrate of Qing and prefecture would make a brief appearance at the poetry meet, much less the first and second scholars. In the past, they would never have had the chance to interact with these people. Even the most famous of them all, Wan Ruoqing, only had the reputation of being a talented woman in a small circle. Tonight's mid-autumn poetry meet was of a much higher standard. Even their seats were arranged to be in such a remote place. And in the center of the garden was a waterside pavilion. Many famous scholars gathered there. This was the true heart of the poetry meet. All the masterpieces that appeared in the poetry meet would eventually be gathered here. The people who commented here were all extremely important scholars, or people of virtue and prestige, or people of high status. Of course, the poetry meet did not only consist of reciting poems. Singers and dancers could be seen everywhere. Their voices were melodious, and their movements were moving. Most of what they sang was the work that had appeared tonight. If there was a good piece, it would quickly be sent out of the garden. Before long, people in the brothels of the city would receive the news and sing out the new work. Ordinary scholars who did not have the right to enter the meet would mostly gather at such a place. They would not miss out on the works of the meet. Poetry meets of all sizes were not rare in the prefectural city tonight. If there were a few outstanding works, they could be sent to the garden to be judged alongside the works of the scholars. Of course, a masterpiece of this level was extremely rare and hard to come by every year. An elegant atmosphere spread throughout the city. At this time, the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet was already halfway through. Qin Yang's performance tonight was average. Even though it was average, there was not much that stood out. It is indeed surprising. Husband Qin's Mid-Autumn Poetry is not bad. Last year, it was in the top 10. I'm afraid it will be difficult to make it today. Qin Yui's poem is not bad. The idea is new and unexpected. It can be considered a rare piece of work. Not bad. With his standard in the past, to be able to write a poem of this level is already very rare. In the middle of the waterside pavilion, in a much wider pavilion, a few scholars were evaluating the poems of the night. They were all scholars that were well known in Qing and Prefecture. Although their opinions did not represent authority, they still had great value as a reference. Beside them, a slender figure leaned against the railing by the water. He held a wine cup in his hand and raised his head to look at the bright moon in the sky. He drank the wine in the cup in one gulp. He couldn't help but murmur, "I raise my cup to invite the bright moon, the shadow becomes 3 people, what's wrong with Brother Yanzhou today? Why isn't he saying anything?" One of the scholars raised his head and looked in a certain direction. A trace of confusion flashed across his face. The other was publicly recognized as the #1 scholar of Qing'an. His poetry was flourishing, and few could compare. Other than Shen Zhao, who could compete with him for the title of champion of the meet, there was no one else who could rival him. Even Shen Zhao could not compare to Yang Yanzhou in terms of mid-autumn poetry. Although he had not yet produced a poem, he had more or less secured the title of champion. But looking at it now, he did not seem to be in high spirits. Chapter 84. Of course, these people did not know that after seeing the 2 poems that had spread like wildfire through the prefectural city yesterday, Yang Yanzhou did not have much anticipation for today's poetry conference. He was the publicly recognized #1 scholar in Qing and Prefecture. When it came to poetry, he naturally had unparalleled confidence. But this confidence had been shaken yesterday. That, remembering your charming maiden, was all right. Although it could be considered a good poem, he still had the confidence to come up with a better one. But that, drinking alone under the moon, that, raising a cup to invite the bright moon, the shadow becomes 3 people, even he was truly shocked. Yang Yanzhou's poems were very popular in Qing and Prefecture, but in reality, he was also very accomplished in poetry. Reading this poem for the first time, it gave him the feeling that he was reading a famous poem left behind by someone before him. He could not bring himself to compare it at all. A similar feeling had appeared a month ago. The first time he heard that, Immortal of the Magpie Bridge, Yang Yanzhou was at the Qixi Poetry Conference. He had just written down the first line of his poem, and after that, he could not write anymore. With pearls and jade in front of him, as the #1 scholar, if Yang Yanzhou's poem could not surpass that, Immortal of the Magpie Bridge, then he might as well not compose it. Shen Zhao, on the other hand, was even more unlucky. His Qixi poem had already received the unanimous praise of the crowd, but when it came to the line, "If the love between 2 could last forever, why would it be day and night?" it was like a firefly compared to the bright moon. It was instantly overshadowed, and no one paid attention to it. After that, Shen Zhao tore that proud poem to shreds in anger and publicly announced that he would no longer compose Qixi poems. Although Yang Yanzhou had not said anything similar, if he did compose Qixi poems in the future, it would only be for his own amusement. He would not bring it out for others to comment on. Not only for the 2 of them, but for the literary world in the future, Qixi poems would be a taboo that the scholars would not lightly touch. After that night, although Yang Yanzhou wanted to get to know the scholar who had written Immortal of the Magpie Bridge, he never got to meet him. Now, he still felt quite regretful. After the incident, there were people who mentioned that person to him and Shen Zhao. There was a faint sense that he was being praised as the foremost scholar of Qing'an. Yang Yanzhou did not care much about this. A poem on the Qixi festival could not prove anything. Some mediocre poets could occasionally produce something that would shock people. For Yang Yanzhou to be recognized by so many people, he naturally had some ability. He wouldn't feel that he was weaker than that person. However, no matter what, such a person was already worth getting to know. Just as he was thinking about these things, a person was already walking over from not too far away. Hearing the approaching footsteps, Yang Yanzhou turned his head and saw a young scholar walking over. Brother Wan, the other party, was also an extremely famous scholar in Qing'an Prefecture. Yang Yanzhou raised his hands in greeting to him. After the other party returned the greeting, he asked curiously, "I saw Brother Yanzhou drinking by yourself for a long time just now. Is there something on your mind?" Yang Yanzhou smiled and said, "Thank you for your concern, Brother Wan. Yanzhou has nothing on my mind. Is it because none of the masterpieces of the scholars tonight were able to catch Brother Yanzhou's eyes?" The scholar smiled and said somewhat mockingly, "That's true. Brother Wan is the foremost scholar of Qing'an Prefecture. Your mind is filled with countless ravines. I'm afraid the works that we are proud of, in your eyes, are extremely mediocre." Yang Yanzhou knew that he was teasing him. Hearing this, he only smiled and didn't speak. At this time, the scholar opened his mouth again and said, "Yesterday's, Drinking Alone Under the Moon, and Remembering Your Charm, Brother Yanzhou, have you heard of them?" Hearing this, Yang Yanzhou nodded and said, "Today, the entire Qing'an Prefecture is discussing this matter. How could I not know such masterpieces? This is also the first time I've heard of the Yunying Poetry Society. I didn't know that there were so many hidden talents in such a small poetry society. I heard that the talented women of the Yunying Poetry Society are also here. Brother Yanzhou, do you want to come with me to pay a visit?" The scholar looked at him and smiled. "I've heard that these two poems weren't written by women. But since they are related to the Yunying Poetry Society, let's go together." Yang Yanzhou nodded. The two of them laughed and chatted as they walked out of the water pavilion in the middle and walked in a certain direction. "Look, isn't that's Master Yang, he's walking over here." "Ah, he's the foremost scholar of Qing'an Prefecture, Yang Yanzhou? He's coming. Is Master Yang coming to our place?" Yang Yanzhou's name was extremely famous in Qing'an Prefecture. As the person with the most attention tonight, no matter where he went, he was destined to be the focus of everyone's attention. Tonight, he hadn't written a poem yet. Who knew how many people's gazes were on him? Especially those women who admired his talent. Their beautiful eyes lit up, and they paid attention to his every move at all times. It immediately caused quite a bit of an uproar. In the pavilion in the corner, the women of the Yunying Poetry Society passed around the excellent works that had been circulated tonight. Occasionally, they would whisper to each other. Their pretty faces were faintly filled with envy. Wan Ruoqing copied down the poems she liked. Zheng Zumo leaned on her shoulder and stared dazedly in a certain direction. She appeared to be somewhat dispirited. She actually wasn't that interested in this poetry gathering. She only thought that if she could meet Li Yi here, she would definitely ask him what kind of technique he used to paint that painting to be so lifelike. However, until now, there was still no news. Although she felt regretful, she also realized that that person probably wouldn't come. Her eyes inadvertently glanced, and there seemed to be a graceful figure flashing by. A beautiful face appeared in front of Zheng Zumo's eyes. After being stunned for a moment, she suddenly stood up. "What is it?" This sudden movement startled Wan Ruoqing. She hurriedly stopped writing and looked at her, asking with concern. "It's her. I saw her just now." Zheng Zumo's pretty face was full of excitement. Her gaze swept around anxiously, but she couldn't find the figure that had been engraved in the depths of her mind. "Who did you see?" Wan Ruoqing asked with confusion. "The woman in the painting, I really saw her just now." The figure flashed by and immediately disappeared. Zheng Zumo's tone became a bit anxious. "What? You saw the woman in the painting? Where?" Wan Ruoqing heard this and was slightly stunned. She immediately stood up and looked at her. "Over there." Zheng Zumo pointed in a certain direction and said, she was there just now, but in the blink of an eye, I couldn't see her. Could it be wrong? Wan Ruoqing asked with some uncertainty. I can't be wrong, Zheng Zumo said with certainty. These days, she had been copying the painting every day. The appearance of the beautiful woman had already been engraved in her mind. How could she be wrong? As long as she could find the woman, she would naturally be able to find the person who painted the painting, the talent named Li Yi. Zheng Zumo was anxious and was about to go search when a few figures walked over from not far away. As those people got closer, the surrounding atmosphere seemed to become a little strange. At this time, somewhere in the garden. May I ask for your name? Li Xian smiled as he looked at the beautiful woman before him in a refined and courteous manner. Lu Rui shot him a nonchalant glance as she coldly spat out a single word. Scram. Chapter 85. Looking at Li Xian retreating with his tail between his legs, Li Yi started to doubt again. Is this guy really a little prince? How could a relative of the imperial family behave in such a way? Who could be more cowardly than him? After all, he was a little prince. How could he tolerate being humiliated by a woman in front of him? If it was someone else, even if she was a woman, they would have given her a tight slap. How dare you insult a relative of the imperial family? Let's teach her a lesson first. Of course, if Li Xian really did that, he would not be able to stand here and talk to Li Yi unscathed. As for Li Yi, he needed to make some preparations to escape with Xiao Huan and Sister Rui. The two men behind Li Xian looked at Lu Rui angrily, but they did not dare to act rashly. Although the woman in front of them was young, she gave them a lot of pressure. Fortunately, although her words to the little prince were a little harsh, it seemed that she would not do anything unfavorable, so the two of them were slightly relieved. Then, the two of them could not help but look at the familiar young man in front of them. If it wasn't for him, Wang Fei would probably still be suffering from her illness. The illness that even the imperial doctors could not do anything about had been easily solved by him. Wang Yi was very happy. He had been sending people to search for her these past few days. He would probably be rewarded handsomely. Thinking that this person was about the same age as the little prince, but he had such abilities, the two of them were very surprised. Brother Li's wife's sister, her temperament, is a little special, Li Xian said to Li Yi with a dry laugh after being chased away by Lu Rui. Lu Rui's temperament could not be described with just the word special. She was a heroine who would draw her sword and cut people at the slightest disagreement. Obviously, this little prince had not realized what was truly special about her. Hee, so this is the fun place that Brother Li mentioned. Li Yi smiled awkwardly and changed the topic. Only now did she realize that the place Li Xian was talking about wasn't a brothel. She was a little disappointed. The atmosphere in the garden looked very elegant. There were scholars and beautiful women, dancers and singers, and people who recited poems and admired the moon. It was very lively. Upon hearing this, Li Xian waved his hand and said, "Calling me Brother Li sounds too distant. I owe you a favor, so you don't need to care about these formalities. You and I can just call each other by name." Although this little prince looked very unreliable, his temperament and nature were very much to Li Yi's liking. If the other party really put on airs in front of him as a little prince, Li Yi would not be too close to him. After all, although he lived in ancient times, he had lived in the 21st century for a long time. He still had some conflict with the ancient concept of hierarchy. Although when in Rome, do as the Romans do, in front of people of the same age, Li Yi did not want to always appear inferior. It was better to try his best to avoid interacting with these so-called big shots. A small willow leaf village was enough for him to deal with. Li Xian patted his shoulder and said, "You might not know this, but this year's Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet will be held in Mianxiu Garden. You can randomly point to anyone and they will be famous scholars. Those talented girls in the prefectural city, or the ladies from the noble families who admire their talent and learning will all be here. Even a few famous prostitutes from the brothels have been invited. If they can write a good poem and suppress the first and second scholars, maybe they will also be favored by them." A dream in a spring night, Li Xian talked non-stop on the side. The dignified little prince of Ning Wangfu was talking about these things with a serious face. Those who didn't know would think that the two of them were discussing poetry. At the very least, Li Yi could see a few women walking past them. Their gazes lingered on them for a long time, and when they walked past them, they would even turn around to look at them. He could vaguely hear them giggling while covering their mouths, saying that the two young masters were really handsome. This was the truth. After Li Yi transmigrated, he was most satisfied with the appearance of this body. No matter how he looked at it, it was extremely handsome. Otherwise, Lu Rui would not have fallen for him at first sight, right? Although this little prince was a playboy and did not do proper things, there was nothing to say about his appearance. If he was placed in the future, he would belong to the type that did not need to rely on talent or family power. He could only rely on his face to make a living. It should be known that those lonely middle-aged rich women liked this type of pretty boy the most. It was unknown where Lu Rui had gone. Li Xian led Li Yi to wander around the garden. From time to time, he would point at a girl and introduce her from afar. This was a famous talented girl in Qing and Fu, this was a top artist in some brothel, this was a daughter of some family. He was even more familiar with the slightly more beautiful girls. This made Li Yi wonder if this little prince had some kind of hobby. After all, with his background, what kind of girl couldn't he get? Why did he have to hide his identity and pretend to be an ordinary person? Why did he have to go to the jadeite courtyard and listen to songs all day? Or maybe the other party's realm was far higher than his, and this was just his attitude towards life. He was originally a member of the royal family, but he hid in the mortal world, playing in the mortal world, passing through thousands of flowers, not a single leaf touching him. However, no matter how he looked at it, he didn't seem like an expert with this kind of awareness. The environment in Mianxiu Garden was indeed much better than the outside. Putting aside the talented girls and rich young ladies, at least the singing and dancing here was quite good, and the taste of the wine and pastries was not bad. Just now, Li Xian said this was some mid-autumn poetry meet. He didn't know if it was the same as what Wan Ruoqing and the others had said yesterday. In any case, he hadn't seen them here yet. It had to be said that the ancients really had too much free time. They didn't find it annoying even if they held poetry meets all day. However, he didn't see how much they cared about industry. It was meaningless to do these things, just as the two of them were walking toward the most lively water pavilion. In another remote corner of the garden, Wan Ruoqing and a few women from the Yunying Poetry Society stood up. Zheng Zumo, who had wanted to find the girl in the painting, had to stop as well. A few figures walked over from the front and blocked her path. "Are you the talented girls from the Yunying Poetry Society?" The young man walking in front clasped his hands at them and said with a smile. Zhao Yunru walked out and looked at the seemingly familiar man. She asked with some confusion, "We don't dare to call ourselves talented girls." "Sir, you are," the young man smiled. When he opened his mouth again, a voice traveled over. "This one is Shen Zhao." The women, including Zhao Yunru, were stunned for a moment. Then, they couldn't help but cry out. Chapter 86. The name of Shen Zhao was not unfamiliar to Zhao Yunru and the women of the Yunying Poetry Society. He was a renowned talent in Qing and Prefecture. Although he had always been suppressed by Yang Yanzhou and could only be number 2 for 1,000 years, in the eyes of others, his talent was still boundlessly high. The girls covered their mouths and exclaimed softly. Although they were known as talented women, Shen Zhao and Yang Yanzhou were still existences that they had to look up to in their hearts. To a certain extent, they were no different from those girls who admired their talents. "So it is young Master Shen. Just now, I read young Master Shen's poems. Young Master is brimming with talent. I am filled with admiration." Shen Zhao had already composed a mid-autumn festival poem. Zhao Yunru and the women of the Yunying Poetry Society had already seen it. As the president of the Poetry Society, although Zhao Yunru was surprised that Shen Zhao had come to speak with them, she still bowed politely and spoke with a smile. "Miss, you are too kind. I am not worthy of such praise." Shen Zhao raised his hands in a salute and then looked at her. Not to mention that, drinking alone under the moon, even though remembering your charming, that your society took out yesterday is something that I cannot compare to. Hearing this, Zhao Yunru's expression froze slightly as if she hadn't expected Shen Zhao to suddenly say such a thing. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. Just at this time, she heard Shen Zhao ask again, I wonder if the talent who wrote, raising a cup to the bright moon, the shadow becomes 3 people, is here tonight? Hearing this, Zhao Yunru finally understood that this was Shen Zhao's purpose in coming. She said somewhat apologetically, to be honest, that young master is not here tonight. That is a bit of a pity. Shen Zhao's expression was somewhat disappointed. If those 2 excellent poems were taken out tonight, there would be no doubt that they would become the champion of the Mid-Autumn Festival. I don't think so. The poem that Brother Shen wrote tonight is also the pinnacle of Mid-Autumn Festival poems. It may not be any weaker than those 2. Yes, that, remembering your charming, is too sentimental. In my opinion, it cannot compare to Brother Shen. Although drinking alone under the moon is good, it is not a poem. There is no need to compare. When Shen Zhao walked over, there were already many people following him. At this moment, when one of them spoke, everyone immediately agreed. Being praised by so many people, Shen Zhao was naturally very happy in his heart. Although he modestly declined a few words, his face was still slightly proud. For today's poetry meet, he had already composed a poem for the Mid-Autumn Festival a few months ago. After many months of polishing and deliberating, he finally finalized it not long ago. He was extremely satisfied with the standard of this poem. He wanted to suppress Yang Yanzhou in the Mid-Autumn Festival poetry meet and also release the resentment that had been suppressed by him for a long time. But no matter how he calculated, he did not expect that on the day before the Mid-Autumn poetry meet, a dark horse would suddenly appear. Those 2 Mid-Autumn poems were thrown out, and even he was stunned. Shen Zhao was good at writing lyrics, not good at composing poems. He didn't have much of an impression of drinking alone under the moon, but the standard of remembering your charming was comparable to the Mid-Autumn Festival poem he had prepared. If the 2 were to be compared at the same poetry meet, even someone as confident as Shen Zhao couldn't guarantee that he would win. Fortunately, that poem was taken out before the Mid-Autumn Festival poetry meet. Naturally, it could not participate in tonight's selection. Otherwise, before he could compete with Yang Yanzhou, he might be defeated by that poem. Of course, this was not entirely a bad thing. At least from Shen Zhao's point of view, that person would not be able to produce a poem of that level in a short period of time. But that person's reputation was already known by everyone. If he could suppress that person tonight, it would probably greatly increase his own reputation. At that time, if he could defeat Yang Yanzhou, perhaps the title of the number 1 scholar in Qing'an Prefecture would fall onto Shen Zhao's head. Just now, he had sought out the Yunying Poetry Society with such thoughts in mind. But what he didn't expect was that that person would not participate in tonight's poetry meet. He couldn't help but feel a bit disappointed. Zhao Yunru listened to the flattering words of those people and didn't know what to say. It was common for scholars to flatter each other. But even though Shen Zhao's reputation was there, in Zhao Yunru's heart, the talent of that gentleman yesterday was already on the same level as Shen Zhao and Yang Yanzhou. Although that person isn't here tonight, Miss One of the Yunying Poetry Club is also extraordinarily talented. Even men like us are ashamed of ourselves. I wonder what masterpiece Miss One will have tonight? At this moment, a voice suddenly came from the crowd. Seeing the man walk out from the crowd, the expressions of Zhao Yunru and the women of the Yunying Poetry Society changed slightly. Su Wentian. Even though they didn't know why he was here, it was clear that he did not have good intentions. Everyone present was somewhat familiar with the name Wan Ruoqing. After all, Qing'an Prefecture was so big. Even though there were many scholars, there were only a few talented women who could be named. Naturally, everyone was familiar with them. This was the first time Shen Zhao had heard of this. He was extremely famous for his talent and had no interest in those who were not as famous as him. My talent is mediocre and naturally cannot compare to the scholars here. It's just a humble piece of work, so I won't embarrass myself, Wan Ruoqing said faintly. Her attitude was extremely humble. "Miss Wan, there is no need to be so humble. The poem you took out that day, Immortal of the Magpie Bridge, is something that we will never be able to match in our lifetime." Su Wentian's face was still full of smiles. As he spoke, his eyes inadvertently glanced at Shen Zhao. As expected, after hearing the 3 words, Immortal of the Magpie Bridge, Shen Zhao's expression did not look too good. That day, because of this poem, in a moment of impulse, he personally tore up his proud work and swore that he would never compose qixi poems again. After thinking about it, he regretted it greatly. But with his status, since he had already said it, he naturally could not take it back. However, every time he thought about it, he felt very uncomfortable. Now that Su Wentian mentioned it, it brought back some bad memories. But, wasn't that poem written by a scholar named Li Yi? What does it have to do with the woman in front of him? That, Immortal of the Magpie Bridge, was it really written by you? Shen Zhao looked at her and asked in shock. "Young Master Shen, you misunderstand. Immortal of the Magpie Bridge was indeed written by a scholar named Li Yi. I merely saw it by coincidence," Wan Ruoqing explained. The story of the sky prayer lantern is too outrageous. I don't believe it." Before Shen Zhao could speak, Su Wentian shook his head and said, "Let's not talk about this for now. You have the reputation of being a talented woman. A mere Mid-Autumn Festival poem, I'm afraid you can easily compose it. Are you looking down on the scholars here?" That day at the Qixi poetry meet, Su Wentian was there. Of course, he knew that the poem was not written by Wan Ruoqing. But after what happened yesterday, Su Wentian's reputation was completely ruined. He hated the Yuning Poetry Society to the extreme. He had gone through so much to obtain the right to attend today's meet. If he didn't embarrass them in front of everyone, he would not be able to swallow this anger. At this moment, Shen Zhao pondered for a moment and finally spoke. "This brother's words make sense. The purpose of today's poetry meet is to exchange pointers and make friends through literature. If you still refuse, then you are really looking down on us." When Su Wentian spoke, Shen Zhao already had a trace of suspicion in his heart. Now, he went along with his words. Whether or not this woman had that kind of poetic talent, after she composes a poem, he would naturally know. Brother Shen's words make sense. Yes, you don't have to decline anymore. We also want to see the poetic talent of the talented lady of Qing and Fu. With Shen Zhao as the leader, the people present all agreed. Seeing this, the expressions on Zhao Yunro and the women of the Yuning Poetry Society became ugly. Exchanging pointers was voluntary. Forcing someone to compose a poem had never been heard of. Shen Zhao and the others were bullying people by doing this. Wan Ruoqing had a difficult expression. It wasn't that she couldn't compose a Mid-Autumn Festival poem, but her improvisation was only average. Su Wentian would definitely use this as a pretext. This was something she didn't want to see. Su Wentian saw the expressions of Wan Ruoqing and the women of the Yuning Poetry Society. A trace of mockery rose to the corner of his mouth. "So what if I look down on you? So many men bullying a weak woman, you are shameless to the extreme." At this time, a voice clearly traveled into everyone's ears. There was a moment of silence. Then, anger rose to the faces of several people. They all turned their heads and looked in the direction of the voice. Under the moonlight, the white-clothed woman stood there with her sword and looked coldly at them. Chapter 87. Who are you? What did you mean by that? At the poetry meet, exchanging pointers is a common thing. How is it shameless? If you don't give us an explanation today, I'm afraid we won't agree. Hearing that voice, all the scholars turned to look at the white-clothed girl standing there, their faces full of anger. To these proud and arrogant scholars, face was undoubtedly extremely important. To be called shameless by a woman, how could they tolerate it? If it wasn't for the fact that this girl was extremely beautiful and they still had some pity in their hearts, it wouldn't have been as simple as a few questions. Shen Zhao's face darkened as well. As the second scholar of Qing and Prefecture, forcing a girl to compose a poem was indeed inappropriate. But he was used to being high and mighty. No matter what he said or what he did, countless people would agree. As for whether it was appropriate or inappropriate, Shen Zhao didn't care. But for someone to point it out like this, it was clearly not giving him face. Shen Zhao's eyes were cold. He looked at her and said, even though the scale of today's mid-autumn poetry meet is large, there are even more scholars in the prefectural city. I don't know how many scholars will not be able to participate. Since the talented women of the Uniying Poetry Society have been invited to participate, your talents must be exceptional. If you can't come up with a decent poem, isn't that a bit unreasonable? Shameless is shameless. No matter how many excuses you find, it's still shameless. The woman's expression was still as cold as ever. She said bluntly, your literary talent isn't that great, but your skin is quite thick. You're making things difficult for a woman. Not to mention a genius, I'm afraid you're not even a man. As the top scholar of Qing and Prefecture, he was actually questioned by a girl about his literary talent and whether he was a man. No matter how good Shen Zhao's composure was, he almost couldn't control the anger in his heart. It took a long time for him to calm down. This girl's words also made these scholars speechless. To make things difficult for a girl like this, it was indeed disgraceful. But she actually said that Shen Zhao's literary talent wasn't that great, perhaps even Yang Yanzhou wouldn't dare to say such a thing? It seemed that this woman did not know that the person standing in front of her was the second most talented scholar of Qing and Prefecture, Shen Zhao. Ruoqing and Zheng Zumo had no idea what these people were thinking. The two girls stared blankly at the woman holding the sword. They were extremely familiar with that beautiful face. It was exactly the same as the one in the painting. Please forgive me for my poor eyesight, but I wonder where you are from? Shen Zhao looked at the woman aggressively, anger clearly visible on his face. Since you look down on me, you must be much more talented than me. Why don't we compete during this poetry meet? If you can come up with a poem that surpasses me, I'll accept it wholeheartedly. Otherwise, I hope you can give me an explanation for today's matter. When Shen Zhao said those words, it was obvious that he wanted to challenge him. The meaning behind this was naturally not as simple as a spar. This kind of thing was not uncommon among scholars. Two scholars would compete in poetry, and the loser would have to admit that his talent was inferior to the other. For scholars who valued their reputation as much as their lives, this would be a stain that they would never be able to erase for the rest of their lives. Of course, the reason why Shen Zhao did this was because he did not believe that he would lose. The other was only a woman. How could she compare to him in terms of poetry? At this time, Wan Ruoqing quickly walked to the side of the white-clothed girl and hurriedly said, he is the second most talented scholar of Qing and Prefecture. He is extremely talented in poetry. Miss, please do not agree. Lu Rui naturally would not agree to a poetry competition with this Shen. She ignored Shen Zhao and looked indifferently at a certain figure in the back of the crowd. Everyone was puzzled when they saw this, and they looked in that direction as well. Being stared at by so many people, even if Li Yi wanted to watch the show, he could not continue. Moreover, his sister-in-law was about to be bullied. As the brother-in-law, it would be embarrassing for him not to stand out. Miss Ruoqing, Miss Zumo, what a coincidence, we meet again. Zheng Zumo greeted Wan Ruoqing with a smile and walked out from the crowd. The young prince, Li Xian, followed behind Li Yi. Seeing that he and the two girls seemed to know each other, his mind was filled with confusion. The last time the two went to the jadeite courtyard, he clearly did not know Zheng Zumo. How long had it been since then? How did the two of them hook up? Young master, seeing him here, Wan Ruoqing and Zheng Zumo's faces showed surprise. After a moment, the two seemed to think of something at the same time. They looked at each other and then looked at Lu Rui. Could it be? An unbelievable guess surfaced in their minds. It's him. Someone in the crowd suddenly exclaimed. He is the talent who wrote Drinking Alone Under the Moon and Remembering Your Charm yesterday. At this time, someone finally recognized Li Yi. Just as Li Yi walked out, Su Wenqian's expression changed and then darkened. It was because of this young man that he could not establish himself in his original circle and became the laughingstock of others. Su Wentian's hatred for him was already deep in his bones. He is the talent who wrote those 2 poems. At the back of the crowd, Yang Yanzhou and the talent with the surname Wan showed a trace of surprise on their faces. Could it be that the great second talent of Qing and prefecture only knows how to bully women? Li Yi's lips twitched as he looked at Shen Zhao. Just now, at the back, he had heard someone say that this guy was the second talent or something. It seemed like he was quite famous. Now, it seemed like this Shen Zhao's literary talent was still unknown. As for his character, TSK, seeing him look at Shen Zhao with a mocking expression, the eyes of the few talented women of the Yunying Poetry Society lit up. At this moment, Li Yi's image in their hearts was without a doubt, even more glorious than before. At this moment, the way the talents looked at Li Yi was somewhat different. Everyone was very clear in their hearts that the young scholar had stepped forward at this time, and the meaning he wanted to express was very clear. Release those women, if you have any problems, come at me. Since he knew that Shen Zhao was the second talent of Qing and prefecture and still dared to speak to him like this, was he arrogant and conceited, or was he fearless? Of course, in the hearts of most people, they only felt that he was too arrogant. If the words just now were spoken by Yang Yanzhou, perhaps the crowd would not be so surprised. However, how could a nameless scholar compare to the famous Shen Zhao? Only an extremely small number of people with eyes knew that the person who could compose those 2 poems was also extremely talented. Even Shen Zhao might not be able to easily defeat him. At this moment, Ruoqing and Zheng Zumo's feelings were simply indescribable. Shock, surprise, joy, and a deep sense of disbelief. If their guess was correct, then no matter how talented Shen Zhao was, in front of him, what could he amount to? Chapter 88. Even though the seats arranged for Wan Ruoqing and the others at the poetry meet were very remote and not easy to attract attention, ever since Shen Zhao brought these people over, many gazes were cast in this direction. Just now, when this unfamiliar scholar stood out and confronted Shen Zhao, the crowd began to discuss spiritedly. The crowd in the distance also finally realized that something seemed to have happened here, and more figures began to gather here. For people like me, exchanging pointers and poems is a common thing. There is no difference between talented men and women. I just wanted to see this lady's talent. What's wrong with that? There were already many people surrounding them. Shen Zhao's face recovered his gentle and refined expression as he countered with a question. Writing poems and lyrics are originally a way for scholars to cultivate their character and cultivate their character. It is not a tool for competing for power. To make things difficult for a woman like this is the behavior of a lowly person. It is not the behavior of a gentleman, Li Yi said faintly. Scholars usually boasted of themselves as gentlemen. To say, not the behavior of a gentleman, was already a great insult to them. No matter what, Shen Zhao was a person of status in Qing and prefecture. Just now, he was called shameless by a woman. Now, he was called a lowly person. Ever since he became famous, when had he been humiliated like this? The refined expression on Shen Zhao's face had long disappeared. It was so dark that it was about to drip water. At this time, the way some people looked at Li Yi changed. Poetry was a way to cultivate one's character and cultivate one's character. It was not a tool for competing for power. Not to mention his talent in poetry, just this insight alone was better than many self-proclaimed scholars. Jingui used his literary skills to become an official, which inevitably increased the utilitarian heart of the scholars. Over time, when it came to writing poems and lyrics, there would definitely be a difference in who was better and who was worse. The first and second scholars were actually fought out in this way. For this scholar to say such things, he was most likely a person with an indifferent temperament and no desire for fame and fortune. At this time, even those who were familiar with Shen Zhao couldn't help but look at him in a different light. Wan Ruoqing's beautiful eyes lit up. She had guessed correctly. Even though this gentleman was very talented, he was different from most scholars. He was truly a refined scholar with a noble heart. But when it came to money, forget it. Since he was a refined scholar, it wasn't a big deal to have some weird hobbies. It was precisely because of this that he was different from those people. Brother, since you have such a temperament, I'm sure your poetic talent isn't too bad either. I'm not talented, but I'd like to experience it for myself. Since they had already shed all pretense of cordiality, Shen Zhao no longer beat around the bush and spoke in an aggressive tone. At this point, there was no longer any room for negotiation. When there was a conflict between scholars, they naturally wouldn't fight with their fists like ordinary people. Whoever won would be in the right. Between them, it was popular to fight with words. The rights and wrongs of this matter had always been unclear. Even though Shen Zhao was indeed a little forceful, but this sort of thing was not uncommon in the circle of these scholars. Now that things had developed to this stage, no one cared about whether the cause was right or wrong. Once the two poems were brought out, it was clear who was better. If one's talent was not as good as the other, then one would naturally have to bow down to the other. Of course, the premise was that he would accept Shen Zhao's challenge. In reality, Li Yi was also considering this problem. For Shen Zhao to be called the second gifted scholar, he must have some talent. If Shen Zhao didn't come up with a poem that could suppress the situation, wouldn't he be at a disadvantage if Shen Zhao went back on his word? He didn't know many people here, so he wouldn't be at a disadvantage. However, he couldn't bear to bring out a really good poem. Those were all shining silver. Right now, Li Yi's career had just started and he was in urgent need of silver. That kind of poem could be sold for at least a few hundred taels of silver. It wasn't worth it to just throw it out like that. Little Prince Li Xian tugged on Li Yi's sleeve and whispered, "Don't fall for it. Even though this fellow's character is bad, he is very talented." He was obviously on Li Yi's side and didn't want Li Yi to be humiliated by Shen Zhao in public. Li Yi really didn't consider how talented Shen Zhao was. No matter how talented he was, could he be more talented than Li Bai or Su Shi? If he lost to a nobody like Shen Zhao in a poetry competition, Li Yi wouldn't have the face to meet these big shots in 100 years. No, he had to save face, and he couldn't take the loss. Li Yi decided to clarify things first. Therefore, while everyone was staring at him and waiting for his response, Li Yi quietly moved 2 steps towards Wan Ruoqing and whispered, "Miss Ruoqing, is there any reward for your poetry competition?" Reward? Wan Ruoqing was slightly stunned and looked at him with a puzzled expression. That is, if someone comes up with a good poem, just a few hundred taels of silver. Wan Ruoqing was stunned and raised her head to look at him. After confirming that Li Yi wasn't joking, she said with a headache, "No." Although the two of them purposely lowered their voices, everyone's attention was on Li Yi. Many people still heard their conversation. Realizing that this scholar was actually hesitating on this question, everyone couldn't help but look at each other. Their hearts were like 10,000 galloping horses. If he really beat Shen Zhao tonight, his fame would definitely spread throughout Qing and prefecture. At that time, he could casually write a poem and there would be countless people fighting over it. Why would he be short of a few hundred taels of silver? Those top scholars, which one of them lacked these worldly possessions? Of course, Li Yi didn't understand the situation in their circle, so he didn't think about this. You want me to come up with a good poem without money? Dream on. Just as he was about to open his mouth to refuse, Shen Zhao's expression changed. He suddenly pulled off a jade pendant from his waist and said coldly, "This jade pendant of mine is worth at least 300 taels of silver. If you win, this jade pendant is yours." Li Yi took the jade pendant from his hand and played with it for a while. He felt that the feel of this thing was not bad, but he still didn't have an accurate estimate of the value of this jade pendant. He casually handed it to Li Xian and asked, "Look, is this thing worth 300 taels of silver?" Seeing this scene, the corner of Shen Zhao's mouth twitched and his fists tightened. The image of a scholarly scholar no longer existed. The expressions of the surrounding people were complicated. Their impression of this scholar was once again subverted. That Yunying Poetry Club, how did they find such an eclectic talent? Wan Ruoqing rubbed her brows helplessly. Zheng Zumo's pretty face was stunned. The women of the Yunying Poetry Society saw the gazes everyone was looking at them and their faces couldn't help but blush. However, a glimmer of light flashed through Lu Ruoi's beautiful eyes. 300 taels of silver, it sounded like a good deal. After being appraised by the knowledgeable young Prince Li Xian, Shen Zhao didn't use a fake jade pendant to trick them. This meant that this deal could be done. Under the gazes of the crowd, Li Yi finally nodded. Since it is a competition, this place is naturally not suitable. Let's go over there. Shen Zhao looked at him coldly and led the way to the center of the crowd where the waterside pavilion was the most crowded. Su Wendian glanced at Li Yi with an extremely pleased expression, feeling extremely carefree in his heart as he hurriedly followed. He actually dared to compete with Shen Zhao. Tonight would be the night he would lose all face. When Shen Zhao and his group left in a grandiose manner, the surrounding people also looked at Li Yi with complicated expressions and quickly followed. Let's go over as well. Li Yi turned back to look at the people who were still standing in place. At this time, Wan Ruoqing bit her lip and suddenly raised her head to look at him. She asked, "We parted in a hurry yesterday. I still haven't asked for young master's name?" As soon as she finished speaking, Xing Zumo also abruptly raised her head to look at Li Yi. An expression of extreme anticipation appeared on her pretty face. Zhao Yunra glanced at Wan Ruoqing and felt a bit anxious. Right now, they should be thinking about how to deal with Shen Zhao's provocation. This was not the time to ask these questions. Li Yi smiled and said, "This one is not asking for advice. This one is called Li Yi. Miss Ruoqing can directly call me by my name." Li Yi. Wan Ruoqing murmured these two words. Although she had already guessed it, she still couldn't believe it when she heard it from his own mouth. As expected, Xing Zumo bit her lower lip tightly and looked at him with a complicated expression. All the doubts in her heart were completely resolved the moment she heard, "This one is called Li Yi." Chapter 89. Xing Zumo now understood why he lost his composure when he heard her sing Celestial Magpie Bridge. It was because he was the one who wrote the poem. He probably didn't think that the poem written on the sky lantern would be picked up by Sister Ruoqing and spread throughout Qing and Prefecture. Yesterday, he had been dismissive of Su Wentian's poems. With a wave of his hand, he had written 2 poems of a very high standard. Before this, no one knew that there was such a talent in Qing and Fu. This made everyone very confused. All of this could be explained. This was because he was Li Yi, the one who wrote, "If the love between 2 lovers lasts for a long time, why should they be together day and night?" He was also the talent Li Yi that Sister Ruoqing, herself, and countless women in Qing and Prefecture yearned for. Li Yi? But the Li Yi who wrote, "If love lasts, why do we stay together day and night?" Zhao Yunru and the women of the Yunying Poetry Society were dumbfounded. They murmured to themselves, stunned for a moment and still in disbelief. He was the most mysterious scholar in Qing and Prefecture recently, the one whose Celestial Magpie Bridge made Yang Yanzhou concede defeat, the one who made Shen Zhao declare that he would no longer compose Qixi poems, the one who countless women, including themselves, wanted to meet? Zhao Yunru and the others' first reaction was disbelief. But when they thought of the 2 poems yesterday, they no longer had any doubts. In such a short amount of time, how could Qing and Prefecture produce 2 talents who could stand shoulder to shoulder with Yang Yanzhou and Shen Zhao? So they were the same person. The young prince, Li Xian, stood there in a daze. His expression was one of shock. Was this guy famous in Qing and Prefecture? Why hadn't he heard of him before? What are you all standing there for? Li Yi looked at them with confusion. He shook his head and walked toward the water pavilion in the center. At this time, because of Shen Zhao, the water pavilion in the center had attracted the attention of countless people. Did you hear that young Master Shen is going to compete with someone in poetry today? What? Isn't young Master Shen the number 2 talent? Who else does he need to compete with? Could it be Yang Yanzhou? That doesn't seem to be the case. We'll know what's going on once we keep watching. How dare he compete with young Master Shen? Isn't he digging his own grave? Under Shen Zhao's deliberate efforts, the news quickly spread throughout the entire Mianxiu garden, and the crowd began to gather in that direction. When Wan Ruoqing, Xing Zumo, and the woman from the Yunying Poetry Club walked over behind Li Yi, they were also shocked by such a scene. But when he thought of his poem, The Immortal at the Magpie Bridge, Shen Zhao no longer dared to compose any more qixi poems and his heart immediately calmed down. Is that young master going to compete with young Master Shen? That young master is so handsome. This is a competition of literary talent, not who is good looking, but he really is better looking than young Master Shen. It was not convenient for the women in the hall to get close, so they could only watch from afar. Occasionally, their voices could be heard. In the center of the waterside pavilion, in a spacious pavilion, Shen Zhao was already standing in front of a table. On the table was a brush, ink, paper, and inkstone. His expression was calm and unreadable. At this moment, this place had already been surrounded by many scholars. As the second most talented scholar in Qing and Prefecture, Shen Zhao was naturally a hot topic. The news of Shen Zhao's poetry competition tomorrow would definitely be the topic of conversation among the scholars of Qing and Prefecture. Brother Yanzhou. Yang Yanzhou and the scholar with the surname Wan were also in the crowd. Suddenly, a voice came from beside them. Looking back, they found it was a scholar they were familiar with. That person looked at Yang Yanzhou and asked in confusion, someone actually agreed to compete with Shen Zhao in poetry? Does he not know that in Qing and Prefecture, Shen Zhao's poetry skills are second only to Brother Yanzhou's? This is a situation where he will definitely lose. Brother Yanzhou, what do you think about this? Yang Yanzhou shook his head and said slowly, definitely lose? I don't think so. Brother Yanzhou, what do you mean? Yang Yanzhou actually didn't think Shen Zhao was optimistic. That person's expression froze. He had a faint premonition. Tonight, there would probably be big news. The surrounding people had been paying attention to the conversation between Yang Yanzhou and him. Hearing this, they immediately focused their attention and listened carefully. What if that person is the scholar who wrote, raising a cup to the bright moon, facing the shadows to form three people? After Yang Yanzhou said this, the surrounding crowd was silent for a moment. Then, they immediately burst into an uproar. It was also at this time that Li Yi and the others finally walked over. When they walked to the table beside Shen Zhao turned his head to look at him and said lightly, since it is the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet, the two of us will use the Mid-Autumn Festival as the theme. We will each write a poem. As for who will win and who will lose, let the scholars here judge. Naturally, Li Yi had no objections to this. After Shen Zhao finished speaking, he already picked up his brush and began to write on the xian paper in front of him. His brush moved like dragons and snakes. Regardless of the content, it was full of vigor. A scholar came closer and stretched his head to take a look. His face involuntarily revealed an expression of envy. He murmured, as expected of the second scholar. This new Mid-Autumn Festival poem is actually better than the one he just took out. After reading out Shen Zhao's unfinished poem in a low voice, the surrounding scholars all gasped in admiration. Shen Zhao's expression did not change, but he was very proud of himself. This poem was originally prepared to compete with Yang Yanzhou tonight. It was his hope of winning the title of the first scholar in Qing and Prefecture. Naturally, the standard of this poem was not low. Shen Zhao had already written half a poem, but the scholar opposite him only picked up his brush. Someone walked closer and when they stretched their head to take a look, they found that the xian paper in front of him was empty. There were no words. Could it be, he knows that he can't beat Shen Zhao, so he got cold feet? Just as everyone was having these suspicions, little did they know that at this moment, Li Yi was also in a bit of a dilemma. Just now, he had casually picked up his brush and had forgotten that with his unique handwriting, no one present knew how to appreciate it. If he wrote it in this kind of situation, he was afraid that it would be embarrassing. After thinking about it, he made up his mind, dipped the brush in ink, and put the brush down. Very quickly, familiar handwriting appeared on the surface of the paper. Wan Ruoqing and Zheng Zumo lowered their heads to look. After seeing the unique handwriting, they looked at each other and no longer had any doubts in their hearts. This handwriting was the same as the original manuscript of the Immortals of the Magpie Bridge. Other than him, which other scholar could write this? The young prince, Li Xian, looked down in confusion. His eyes suddenly widened as if he had seen something inconceivable. Seeing that he had finally put down his brush, a moment later, someone couldn't resist his curiosity and came forward to take a look. Suddenly, an extremely shocked expression appeared on his face, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He raised his head to look at Li Yi, then looked at the handwriting on the paper with some uncertainty. Finally, his expression became strange. This handwriting. I'm afraid that only a child who has just learned how to write would be able to write this. Following that person's low murmur, a few more people came forward. Wan Ruoqing's pretty face changed slightly when she saw the change in everyone's expression. She immediately took a step forward, grabbed a piece of paper from the side table, and hurriedly began to write on it. A moment later, she looked at Li Yi again. After distinguishing the words and sentences, she started writing again on the paper raft. During this process, an indescribable expression gradually appeared on her pretty face as she looked at the words she had finished transcribing. When Li Yi stopped writing to check if he had missed anything, a piece of paper filled with hairpin-style small regular script had already been passed out of Wan Ruoqing's hands. Let's see what he has written. After seeing Li Yi's handwriting, the surrounding scholars began to doubt whether he had ever been educated. They smiled as they took the paper and looked at it. Shui Diao Getu. The first thing that entered their eyes were these 4 words. When will the moon be bright and clear? Holding a cup of wine, I asked the clear sky. Someone held the paper and read it softly. Not long after, the surrounding noise gradually quieted down. Chapter 90. Shui Diao Getu. Shui Diao Getu. I'm afraid no one will dare to compose a Mid-Autumn Festival poem today. A blank expression appeared on the scholar's face. He had already been shaken by the paper raft in his hand. It's not just today. I'm afraid that from now on, it will be difficult to compose a Mid-Autumn Festival poem. Yang Yanzhou's eyes were also filled with shock. Even though he was known as the #1 scholar in Qing and Prefecture, he would never be able to compose a poem of this standard. At this moment, all the scholars at the scene were no longer as noisy as before. Yang Yanzhou's gaze once again swept across the paper raft, and finally noticed the name at the bottom. His heart suddenly jumped, and he exclaimed, Li Yi. What? Hearing this, everyone's bodies trembled. They all lowered their heads. In the next moment, an even greater uproar erupted. He is Li Yi. Li Yi from Immortal Magpie Bridge, ? That, Drinking Alone Under the Moon, was also written by him? The moment they saw the name of the poem, the shock in their hearts exceeded the poem itself. Ever since the Mid-Autumn Festival a month ago, everyone had their own guesses as to who the author of Immortal Magpie Bridge was. But it was undeniable that this person's talent was astonishing. With just one Mid-Autumn Festival poem, he had already been elevated to the same status as Yang Yanzhou and Shen Zhao. Including Yang Yanzhou, who knew how many people wanted to meet this scholar named Li Yi, but no one was able to do so. No one thought that he would appear in such a manner. With a wave of his hand, he produced an extremely high-standard Mid-Autumn Festival poem. Not just Shen Zhao, but even among all the scholars in the Jing Kingdom, who could compare to him? Thinking of this, everyone couldn't help but glance at Shen Zhao, who was still happily writing. The expressions on their faces were especially interesting. A month ago, because of the Immortal Magpie Bridge, Shen Zhao tore his proud work into pieces in front of all the scholars in Qing and Prefecture. He announced that he would never compose a Mid-Autumn Festival poem again. From today onwards, he probably wouldn't even be able to compose a Mid-Autumn Festival poem. If 2 lovers love each other for a long time, why would they stay together day and night? Raising a cup to the bright moon, the shadow becomes 3 people. May we live together for a long time, Yang Yanzhou muttered to himself, and a self-mocking smile appeared on his face. He said, everyone says that I, Yang Yanzhou, am the #1 scholar in Qing and Prefecture. When I compete with others, I have never tasted defeat in poetry. Today, I know that there are people better than you. From now on, the title of #1 scholar in Qing and Prefecture should not be mentioned again. Brother Yanzhou, Scholar Wan opened his mouth, but in the end, he only patted his shoulder and didn't say anything. The Immortal on the Magpie Bridge, Drinking Alone Under the Moon, Shui Diaogetu, these poems were enough to scare many people to death. If Yang Yanzhou still carried the title of the foremost scholar in Qing and Prefecture, this was not praise for him, but a great mockery. He looked at the back of the scholar with a complicated expression and sighed in his heart. Since Li Yi was born, how could Yang Yanzhou be born? He couldn't help but look in Shen Zhao's direction. He must have committed too many sins in his past life to have to compete with this kind of person. After today, Shen Zhao would probably have a hard time keeping a foothold among the scholars in Qing and Prefecture. Look, even though this style of writing is not restricted by rules, the strokes are smooth, the structure is simple, and the strokes are continuous. Amidst the frenzy, there is a hint of elegance. I'm afraid that he is quite accomplished in calligraphy. A scholar stared at the manuscript on the table and suddenly exclaimed. When the crowd heard this, they all lowered their heads to look at it. For some reason, the words that looked like a child's scribble now looked much more pleasing to the eye. There seemed to be a certain rhythm between the lines. Thinking about it carefully, what the scholar said just now did seem to make some sense. Brother Wang's words are reasonable. Our eyes were blind and almost made a mistake. Not bad, not bad. How could someone with such talent not know calligraphy? Could it be that this style was created by this brother? Yang Yanzhou stood to the side and listened to the discussions of the crowd. A trace of doubt floated onto his face. Could it be that the other party's cultivation level was too high? Even with his skill in calligraphy, he could not comprehend the beauty of this style. Even Li Yi couldn't help but blush when he heard these words. He coughed to hide the awkwardness in his heart. When he put down his brush, he saw Li Xian, Wan Ruoqing, Xing Zumo, and the others standing behind him. They looked at him with a complicated expression. What is it? Is there ink on my face? Li Yi was stunned and asked in confusion. He reached out and wiped his face. He looked down at his palms. There was no ink. No one nodded and no one spoke. Li Xian looked at him with a burning gaze. It was as if he was meeting him for the first time. Originally, he thought that the other party was an interesting scholar who was good at painting, greedy for money, and had a low tolerance for alcohol. On top of that, he had cured his mother's depression. His impression of him improved greatly and he was willing to interact with him, but who would have thought that this scholar, who did not have any outstanding qualities other than his good looks, was so talented that even the top scholar of Qing and Prefecture had to admit defeat. This guy was even better at hiding than he was. Wan Ruoqing, Xing Zumo, and the others were just as shocked as he was. First, they found out that the young master from yesterday was Li Yi, the one who created Immortal Magpie Bridge. Before they could recover, Shui Diaogetu appeared out of nowhere. Not only did it stun all the scholars present, it also stunned them. Especially when they remembered that he was a member of the Yunying Poetry Society in name, they all wondered if they were dreaming. Pa. Shen Zhao threw the brush in his hand onto the table. The writing on the Xian paper was vigorous and powerful. It was vigorous and free. Even if one ignored the content, it could still be considered a good piece of calligraphy. After all, his reputation as the second scholar did not come from nowhere. To be recognized by so many proud scholars in Qing and Prefecture, Shen Zhao definitely had some ability. He turned his head and saw that the scholar opposite him seemed to have finished writing. The corner of his mouth twitched and he strode over. Because of the distance, when Shen Zhao was concentrating on writing, he did not hear the discussion. At this moment, he walked in front of Li Yi's table and lowered his head to look. His expression froze for a moment, then he laughed loudly. Is this your work, or is it a child's random scribbling? At this moment, Shen Zhao no longer had any doubts about the outcome of this competition. However, as he laughed, his laughter gradually became softer. Because at this moment, he was the only one laughing. The surrounding talents all looked at him with a strange expression. The smile on Shen Zhao's face froze. An extremely bad feeling suddenly arose in his heart. Brother Shen, at this moment, Su Wentian walked over in a daze. In his hand was a paper raft. He looked at Li Yi with a complicated expression and handed the paper raft to Shen Zhao. Chapter 91. At the other end of the pavilion, countless women raised their heads and looked in a certain direction, their hearts filled with anticipation. In the pavilion where the competition was taking place, other than a few talented women, almost all of them were men. With their status, it was naturally not appropriate for them to go over. "Who do you guys think will win this competition?" a pretty woman asked with her hand on her cheek. "Of course it will be young Master Shen." "I also think it will be young Master Shen." "Yes, young Master Shen is so talented, how could he lose to a nobody?" The surrounding women all spoke up, their thoughts shockingly in unison. No one felt that the nameless scholar could win against the second talent of Qing and Fu, Shen Zhao. After all, Shen Zhao had been famous in Qing and Fu for a long time. In the hearts of these women, his position was naturally higher. "But, that young master isn't a nobody," a young girl interrupted. Hearing this, a woman asked, "Right, I still don't know what his name is, Xiao Yun, do you know?" The young woman shook her head and said, "I also don't know what that young master is called, but when I came over from that side, I heard them say that young master is the one who composed Drinking Alone Under the Moon and Nian Nu yesterday." "What?" "It's actually that scholar." Among these women, there were clearly many who knew these two poems. After a moment of surprise, they said hesitantly, "If it's that scholar, he might not necessarily lose." "But, why is young Master Shen competing with that young master in poetry?" Competing in poetry between scholars was a very common thing and not something to be surprised about. But usually, if there was no conflict between the two, it would just be a normal exchange of pointers. But if it was elevated to the level of a battle, it meant that the conflict between the two could not be resolved. The young woman who had just spoken looked around and said somewhat mysteriously, "I heard that because young Master Shen made things difficult for the talented women of the Yunying Poetry Society, that young master, as a member of the Yunying Poetry Society, could not stand young Master Shen's actions, so he stood out." Everyone knows what happened next. How is it possible? How could young Master Shen be this kind of person? "I've heard before that Shen Zhao was arrogant and narrow-minded. I thought it was just a rumor. Who would have thought? I suddenly don't want young Master Shen to win, me too." After the young girl's words were confirmed by a few other women who were also in the know, the balance in these women's hearts finally tilted. At this moment, a young lady dressed like a servant ran over from afar with a paper raft in her hand. She ran to the lady's side and handed the paper raft to her while panting. "Is there any news from there?" When the women saw this, they all crowded around him. "How was it? How was it? Who won? When will the bright moon appear?" I asked the clear sky with a cup of wine in my hand. "I wonder what year it is in the heavenly palace." That woman cast her gaze up and recited in a low voice. Her beautiful eyes suddenly burst out with a strange splendor. The few women gathered their heads, and after a moment, their pretty faces revealed the same expression as hers. This was written by that young master?" After a moment, the woman raised her head and looked at the young servant girl. She asked in disbelief, "Miss, name." The young maid had run all the way here and was panting from exhaustion. She finally caught her breath and opened her big eyes wide. She hurriedly pointed at the bottom corner of the paper raft and said, "Name? What name?" The young lady, who looked like a well-bred lady, looked in the direction that the young maid was pointing. In the next moment, her beautiful eyes involuntarily widened. Her cherry lips slightly parted as she cried out in surprise, "Li Yi." The name Li Yi was not an unfamiliar name to the women of Qing and Fu. Ever since the Immortal Magpie Bridge came out, it was unknown how many young girls in love, young married women, on lonely nights, in the depths of their chambers, would recite, "If the feelings between two could last forever, why would they stay together day and night, while thinking of their absent lovers?" Even those unmarried young girls would imagine a certain scene in their minds. Perhaps in their erotic dreams at night, they would occasionally dream of that scholar named Li Yi. For the women of this era, a man's talent was, without a doubt, a fatal attraction to them. Appearance was actually ranked lower. Of course, if he was a scholar with both talent and appearance, he would certainly be pursued by countless women. Is that the Li Yi from The Immortal of the Magpie Bridge? ? Ah, that handsome gentleman, is that Li Yi? In an instant, countless women raised their heads and looked in the direction of the water pavilion in the center. Their eyes were filled with a strange light. I hope that people live long, thousands of miles apart. When Shinzhao read to this point, his voice was already trembling. Fine beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. He suddenly raised his head to look at him and said in a trembling voice, "You are that, the Immortal of the Magpie Bridge. Brother, if you have finished writing, why don't you hand it over to the scholars to judge?" Li Yi looked at him and asked with a smile. Hearing this, Shinzhao's face turned pale. He knew his own limits. The other party had even brought out such words. What need was there to judge? He was just asking to be humiliated. I lost. Shinzhao's face was pale. After squeezing out these words from between his teeth, he turned and left. Brother, please wait. Seeing that Shinzhao was about to leave, Li Yi hurriedly called out to him. What else do you want? A trace of anger appeared on Shinzhao's face. He had already lost face in front of everyone today. Was the other party still not willing to let it go? Li Yi didn't speak, but his eyes looked at his waist. Shinzhao finally remembered something. His face darkened even more. He tore off the jade pendant at his waist and casually threw it over. Li Yi hurriedly caught it. If it was broken, 300 liang of silver would be gone. When he walked to the side of his table, Shinzhao's footsteps paused. He grabbed the poem he had just written and tore it into pieces. The scholars saw this familiar scene and couldn't help but sigh in their hearts. If they had known this would happen, they wouldn't have done it in the first place. Li Yi held the jade pendant in his hand. In his heart, he was thinking about going to a pawn shop later. 300 liang of silver was enough to rent a shop in a slightly more prosperous area in Qing and Prefecture. At that moment, a delicate young girl walked in from outside. She walked to Li Yi's side and asked gently, "May I ask if you are Li Yi, Li?" Li Yi didn't know what this young girl wanted. He nodded in confusion. The young girl smiled and handed over a piece of paper. "Will you be free tomorrow? My young mistress would like to invite you to her residence for a chat. This looks like Miss Chen's servant. Miss Chen is official Chen's daughter." Seeing this, all of the candidates had expressions of shock and envy on their faces. Before Li Yi could react, a few more young girls walked in from outside. After bowing to Li Yi, they spoke in a gentle voice. "My young mistress admires your talent very much. Tomorrow, there will be a banquet at the Drunken Fragrance Brothel. Will you be free?" My young mistress, that's Miss Chen's servant, that's Lu Qiaoqiao's servant, even prefectural magistrate Dong's daughter." Behind Li Yi, the little prince, Li Xian, stared blankly at this scene. His expression was incomparably complicated. Chapter 92. Since they were daughters of noble families, they had been taught from a young age that their every action had to be dignified and courteous. Not to mention daughters of noble families like the daughter of Magistrate Dong or the daughter of the Qin family, even the slightly more famous courtesans of Qing and Prefecture were usually very reserved and would never publicly invite a stranger. Although most of these girls had only sent their own servant girls, the personal servant girls represented their own wishes. Li Xian really couldn't understand why a mere poem would have such a strong attraction for these girls. It should be known that even though he was a little prince and a relative of the imperial family, these girls only maintained proper etiquette when they saw him. They definitely wouldn't go this far. In this aspect, his influence as a little prince wasn't even as great as Yang Yanzhou or Shinzhao and other famous scholars in Qing and Prefecture. But he had never heard of the daughter of Magistrate Dong ever inviting Yang Yanzhou. Li Xian was very certain that if Li Yi nodded his head right now, perhaps there would be many girls willing to offer themselves to sleep with him tonight. This kind of thing was not rare for scholars in Qing and Prefecture. After tonight, his talent would spread. In the future, he wouldn't even have to pay to visit brothels, and there would probably be girls willing to throw themselves at him. Don't doubt this. There are historical records that show Lu Yong and Tang Bohu were both masters who didn't pay to visit brothels. Spending a night with the #1 scholar of Qing and Prefecture was a good opportunity for those prostitutes to become famous. If they could get him to write a poem, something along the lines of flirtatious, graceful, and devastatingly beautiful, it would be a good hype and would greatly increase the attention of the market, and this kind of handsome, talented scholar was the ideal candidate for Rui in the hearts of the daughters of noble families. In his mind, the scene of Li Yi being surrounded by all kinds of girls floated up. If he could receive his true teachings, in the vast Qing and Prefecture, would there be a girl he couldn't handle? Thinking of this, Li Xian made a decision in his heart: he was definitely going to be a friend. Looking at the girls in front of him handing over handkerchiefs, invitations, and the like, Li Yi felt a headache coming on. After living 2 lives, he really couldn't handle such a scene. He looked to Lu Rui for help, only to find that she was standing there, staring at Zheng Zumo. No one knew what she was thinking. Just when Li Yi was about to be overwhelmed by the enthusiasm of these girls, Mississippi Lu finally looked over as if she had heard the call in his heart. Li Yi gave her a look, and Lu Rui walked over slowly. The girls felt a gentle force pushing them away. Then, they saw the lady in white grab the young man's shoulder, and with a light leap, the two of them rose into the air, flew over the heads of the candidates, and flew out of the pavilion. In the blink of an eye, they disappeared before their eyes. This scene truly stunned everyone present. The atmosphere was quiet for a moment, and then immediately became uproar. Did I see it wrong? They just flew over my head? That's a fairy. It's over, that young man flew away. How are we going to explain this to the mistress? So powerful. Some of the candidates fell into a daze when they saw the Shui Diaogetu. Only now did they come back to their senses and involuntarily let out a long sigh. That person's attainments in poetry were truly impressive. After today, the #1 scholar in Qing and Prefecture would most likely be someone else. So powerful. Li Xian's eyes were full of envy. If he had this kind of ability, in the entire Qing and Prefecture, whether it was the daughter of Magistrate Dong or the mistress of Official Chen, or even the prostitutes in the brothels who only sold their skills but not their bodies, who wouldn't admire him? So powerful. The 2 plainclothed bodyguards behind Li Xian looked at each other, their eyes filled with shock. This woman's martial arts were extraordinary, and her qinggong was even more so. Before this, they had never heard of such a person. When had such a person appeared in the martial arts world? As expected, there was always someone better. The martial arts world was vast, and there were many capable people. When they returned, they had to report to the young master. The young master's guards would probably need to be strengthened. Deep shock appeared on Wan Ruoqing and Zheng Zumo's pretty faces. They didn't think that the woman who had been standing quietly beside them was such a powerful heroine. After a moment, Wan Ruoqing came back to herself and sighed softly. Li is overflowing with talent and rare in this world. Once the Shui Diaogetu appeared, it already stood at the peak of the Mid-Autumn Poetry Festival. If future generations want to surpass it, it will be harder than ascending to the heavens. It will probably be like the Immortal of the Magpie Bridge, and be passed down through the ages. Zheng Zumo turned her head and looked at her. She took a small step forward and said with a smile, "Sister Ruoqing is right." Wan Ruoqing didn't answer. As if she had thought of something, her eyes suddenly looked at the table in front of her. Seeing this, the expression on Zheng Zumo's pretty face changed slightly. She cursed in her heart that it was still discovered by Sister Ruoqing. With quick steps, she quickly put away the original manuscript of Shui Diaogetu and held it tightly in her arms. All of this happened in a flash. When Wan Ruoqing reacted, Zheng Zumo had already rolled the rice paper into a tube and sat in front of the table. She blinked her big innocent eyes and looked at her with a smile. At this time, she had only taken one step. "Zumo, you." Wan Ruoqing's cherry lips opened slightly. Her pretty face was full of surprise as she looked at Zheng Zumo. She was a little speechless. Now that she had it, a sly smile appeared on Zheng Zumo's face. She looked at Wan Ruoqing and said, "Sister Ruoqing, you already have Immortal Magpie Bridge. Why don't you give this Shui Diaogetive to me?" At this time, the top artist of the jadeite courtyard was like a sly little fox. Her face was full of a smile of success. Not far away, Yang Yanzhou's footsteps stopped, and a wry smile appeared on his face. Someone else had actually made the first move. At this time, outside the garden, Li Yi held onto a big tree and closed his eyes. Only then did the dizziness in his mind subside a little. He had never experienced the feeling of a roller coaster in his previous life. After coming to this world, he had experienced it twice. He was extremely curious. As a woman, why did Lu Rui always not take the right path and like to fly around on the wall? After a long time, when the palpitation completely disappeared, Li Yi turned his head and looked at the pretty woman beside him. His eyes were filled with hidden bitterness as he said, "Lu Rui, you will lose me like this. If you can't even endure this little bump, you won't be able to become a second-rate master even if you practice martial arts for the rest of your life." The sword-hugging woman leaned on a book and glanced at him. The reason she gave actually made Li Yi speechless. As she spoke, one of her lily-white hands retracted into her sleeves. Li Yi didn't see the paper raft that she had secretly hidden. Chapter 93. Today, Qing'an Prefecture was a city that never sleeps. No matter if it was the taverns, brothels, or other shops, they would all be open all night. This was because the profits from this one night were enough to cover several days of normal business. For a place like the tavern, half a day's profit was almost equivalent to 10 days of normal business. Only an honest person like Old Fong would give himself a break when business was at its peak. At this moment, he was probably beating his chest and stamping his feet in regret when he saw the booming business of the other Tanghulu vendors. After coming out of the poetry gathering, Li Yi thought about it carefully and felt some regret. Wasn't it a bit too rash to take out a name like Shui Diaogedu that could be passed down for 100 generations? Even though he had gotten a jade pendant, that jade pendant could at most be exchanged for 300 taels of silver. Thinking about it, it seemed like he had suffered a loss. Just now, any poem from the selected poems of the Song dynasty would have been enough to subdue Shen Zhao. In the end, he had been too impulsive. However, it was too late for regrets now. He didn't think about it anymore. Calming himself down, he picked a pawn shop that looked more proper and walked in. An hour later, Li Yi and Lu Rui walked out of the pawn shop. That Shingai said that this jade pendant was worth at least 300 taels of silver. The black-hearted owner of the pawn shop actually only offered 150 taels, cutting the price by more than half. Li Yi used 15 minutes to whittle the price down to 200 taels, but the other party refused to budge no matter what. In the end, when Lu Rui's delicate brows furrowed and her jade-like hand had already touched the hilt of her sword, Li Yi saw that the situation was not good and hurriedly brought up Shen Zhao's name. Otherwise, this pawn shop owner would be in big trouble tonight. It had to be said that Shen Zhao's name was very useful. Since it was the jade pendant of the second scholar of Qing'an Prefecture, the price was naturally higher. After the pawn shop owner confirmed it, he finally increased the price to 300 taels of silver. Before he left, he deliberately stuffed another 10 taels of silver into Li Yi's hand. With a face full of enthusiasm, he expressed that if Li Yi could get Yang Yanzhou's jade pendant the next time, he was willing to pay double the price. If Li Yi was not satisfied, the price could be discussed again. Li Yi could more or less guess the pawnshop owner's intentions. For a talented man like him who was famous throughout Qing and Fu, there must be many women who admired him. Among them, there was no lack of young ladies from rich families who did not lack money. Buying him for 300 taels and then selling him to them, he could probably earn quite a bit of money. Li Yi couldn't help but sigh in his heart. In this world, talents are indeed popular. When he became famous one day, he could sell autographs, used socks, unwashed underwear, and so on. He could probably make a small fortune. That's right, he seemed to have forgotten to bring the Shui Diaogedu that he had just written. He really shouldn't have. After all, that was the first edition of the manuscript. After he became famous, he would definitely sell it for a few hundred taels of silver. Was it too late to go back and get it now? When he thought of those women who were like wolves and tigers, Li Yi immediately dispelled this thought. With 300 taels of silver in his pocket, Li Yi and Lu Rui were strolling around the busy street. Naturally, he didn't know that the entire Mianxiu garden had already completely boiled over because of that shui diaogetu. A few old men with white hair and beards surrounded a table and stared fixedly at the xian paper on the table. Zheng Zumo stood far away and really wanted to snatch back that shui diaogetu manuscript. However, when she remembered that the old men in front of her were all famous figures in the literary world and had extraordinary statuses, she forcibly suppressed this thought. As a scholar, your handwriting is so sloppy. What a disgrace. An old man's hair was standing on end as he spoke angrily. This caused the surrounding scholars to look at each other, but none of them dared to say anything. Although this old man's temper was explosive, the other party's status was there. Even the prefectural magistrate didn't dare to say anything. The old man had been an official for many years and had students all over the world. There was no lack of high-ranking officials among them. Prefectural Magistrate Dong was also a disciple of the old man. Now that he saw the old man, he had to respectfully call him teacher. After venting his anger, the old man's gaze once again fell on the paper. However, this time, his murky old eyes shone brightly. After a long while, he sighed and said, "What a good poem. People have joys and sorrows, the moon has its waxing and waning. I hope that people live long and live together for thousands of miles." To be able to write a Mid-Autumn Festival poem to such a level, I'm afraid there is no one else in the entire Jing Kingdom who can do this. This person's attainments in poetry have probably reached an unfathomable level. I heard that the Immortal Magpie Bridge, on Chinese Valentine's Day, was also written by him. Another old man beside him retracted his gaze and sighed as well. One poem is full of amorous feelings, the other is bold and unconstrained, the atmosphere is magnificent. It's hard to imagine that these two completely different poems were written by the same person. From today onwards, as long as the students of the Jing Kingdom drink under the moon, they will definitely think of raising a cup to invite the bright moon, the shadows of the three of us. On Chinese Valentine's Day, they will not forget the Immortal Magpie Bridge and Shui Diaogetu. I feel that if he were to compose another Upper Yuan poem, there would be no need for the next few poetry competitions. Just based on poetry alone, even if I were to call him the #1 scholar in the Jing Kingdom, there wouldn't be many who would object. The old man nodded his head, expressing his agreement. However, in the next moment, he raised his eyebrows and scolded, "This kid, has he never thought of practicing his calligraphy?" The surrounding scholars stood respectfully at the side. Hearing the old man and the other famous figures' evaluation of Li Yi, they couldn't help but be secretly shocked. The #1 scholar in the Jing Kingdom. Since ancient times, there was no #1 scholar. When one's poetry reached a certain level, it was difficult to distinguish who was better. There had never been a person who received such an evaluation from them. The Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet was closely watched by the scholars of Qing and Prefecture. Any news would quickly spread. Not long after, a piece of paper floated out of Mianxiu Garden like flying snow. Some busybodies, including the old man's evaluation of the poem, handed it over without the slightest deletion. This included the praise of Li Yi as the #1 scholar in the Jing Kingdom. Very quickly, the news spread throughout the prefecture. In an extremely short period of time, various brothels were already filled with the tune of Shui Diaogetu. Li Yi of the Immortals of the Magpie Bridge appeared at the Mid-Autumn Poetry Meet. In a rage for a beauty, he brazenly accepted a challenge from the second scholar of Qing and Prefecture, Shen Zhao. With one Shui Diaogetu, he stunned the audience and actually caused Shen Zhao to tear his poem twice. When the scholars heard this story, it was as if they were there. Their hearts were filled with hot blood and anger, and they only hated themselves for not being there to witness it. When countless women in their chambers heard their maids talk about the news they heard from outside, their beautiful eyes shone with a strange light. At this time, Li Yi, who was completely unaware of this, was still wandering the streets. However, it was different from before. Right now, there were many more things in the bag on his back. Pouches, perfume pouches, bracelets, hairpins, rouge and face powder. Last time, Rui had given him a piece of clothing that she had personally made. Politeness demanded reciprocity. Now that Li Yi's wallet was bulging again, he naturally wouldn't be stingy in this area. However, if he bought it for Rui, Xiao Huan would definitely also want a portion. Otherwise, even if the little maid didn't say it, she would definitely be hurt in her heart. If he bought it for both of them, he couldn't leave out Rui. If he treated Mississippi Lu differently, the consequences would be very serious, although this would seem insincere, but, at worst, he would just give Rui another gift in the future. Seeing Li Yi once again walk into a jewelry shop, the corners of Lu Rui's mouth curved slightly. Just as she was about to follow him in, her footsteps suddenly paused. Her gaze fell on the two scholars who walked past her on the street. Immortals of the Magpie Bridge. Shui Diaogetu, Minister of Education, that Li Yi, the first scholar of the Jing Kingdom. After obtaining this information from the conversation between the two, Lu Rui's pretty brows furrowed. With confusion and surprise, she looked at the back of the figure in the shop who was bargaining with the shop owner. Chapter 94. The liveliness of Qing and prefectural city would continue for an entire night, but for Li Yi, who had seen even more bustling scenes, after the novelty wore off, he no longer had any interest in strolling around. By the time he returned to the stockade village with Lu Rui, it was already late at night. He didn't see Fong and the others. These country bumpkins who had never seen the world would probably only return at dawn. Li Yi asked Lu Rui to bring the gifts he bought for them into the inner courtyard. After returning to his room, he washed up and went to bed. He didn't have Mississippi Lu's stamina. After walking so much and flying around in the sky, he was still full of energy. As he lay on his bed, he thought about a few things. After the Mid-Autumn Festival, he would start selling Rui's necklaces. Before that, he still needed to rent a shop. In addition, it was time to bring forward the matter of the factory. These few days, he was really exhausted. After these things were over, he still needed to rest for a while. After thinking about this for a while, his eyelids started to feel heavy. At this time, in the inner courtyard, in Lu Rui's room, the two sisters were whispering as usual. Lu Rui's face was filled with surprise and astonishment. Is husband really that amazing? Lu Rui spoke with interest about the expressions on the faces of the scholars in Qing and prefectural city when Li Yi took out the poem in Mianxiu Garden. Occasionally, she would glance in the direction of the window. Outside the room, the little servant girl carefully stuck to the corner of the window. Tonight, she had changed her hair into a new bun with a new hairpin that the son-in-law had bought for her. She tried her best to stick her ear close to the window. When she heard the whispers coming from inside the room, her beautiful big eyes sparkled and her little face was flushed. She looked extremely adorable. The son-in-law is composing a poem again, the #1 scholar. Is he more amazing than all the other scholars? The little girl thought to herself. When the voices in the room gradually quieted down, she raised her head and glanced outside before tiptoeing away. He had been busy all night yesterday, and it was already very late when he woke up in the morning. In the school, as long as he was not around, Lu Xiaohu would take the initiative to take on the responsibility of being the class leader and teach those brats well. Li Yi felt that he could slack off again today. After running outside, he practiced Tai Chi in the courtyard as usual. Of course, he found the books in the library. Regardless of whether they were useful or not, he just treated it as killing time. The scale of the provincial library was already very large, so naturally, there were other martial arts books. However, Li Yi had no intention of learning fighting, sanda, taekwondo, judo, and the like. In this world where everyone was a super saiyan, even if he practiced judo and taekwondo to the 100th stage, he would not be able to withstand a few punches from someone like Old Fong. And if he was unlucky and met Lu Rui, the future world boxing champion or mixed martial arts champion could probably be defeated with a single strike from her. After all, no matter how powerful those people were, they were not so powerful that they could fly in the sky. In the library, there were many traditional Chinese martial arts, such as Tai Chi, Xingyi Quan, Baguazhang, Tong Bei Quan, and so on. But those that could be displayed in the library were naturally extremely simple moves. It was impossible to get to the real core. It was fine to practice for fun, but it was completely impossible to become a martial arts master by relying on these. Of course, it was naturally impossible to find peerless secret manuals like 9 Manual, 18 Subduing Dragon Palms, and 6 Pulse Divine Sword in the modern library. Instead of relying on these, it was better to practice the martial arts basics that Lu Rui had thrown to him. Although he had not yet cultivated the so-called true qi that Rui had mentioned, Li Yi had been learning martial arts for a long time. He estimated that he would have no problem fighting against 3 weak scholars like Xin Zhao. A little further away, Lu Rui stood outside the arched door that connected the 2 courtyards. Seeing Li Yi doing some strange movements, her beautiful eyes showed some surprise. In the first few days, when Li Yi told her that this was a martial art called Tai Chi, Lu Rui did not take it to heart. In martial arts, speed was the key to defeating the slow, and the strong to defeat the weak. It was similar to what he said when he told stories about strange martial arts. In the world of martial arts, there is nothing that cannot be overcome, only speed cannot be overcome. When she heard this, Lu Rui was quite shocked. This summary was really straight to the point. In today's martial arts world, there were many different sects and schools, but they could not escape these words. However, such a sentence that could shock the martial arts world was said by such a scholar. Even grandmasters would be ashamed to hear it. When Lu Rui calmed down these days, she carefully pondered over the few words that he mentioned when he told stories. Unexpectedly, she also realized something and made a small progress in martial arts. Although she still did not break through the shackles and step into the Grandmaster realm, it was very rare for her to make such a small progress with her current realm. Therefore, when Li Yi said that Tai Chi was about defeating the strong with the weak, defeating the fast with the slow, and conquering the hard with the soft, Lu Rui just smiled. Defeating the strong with the weak, and doing the opposite, how could there be such a wonderful martial art in the world? However, these past few days, she had often seen these movements, so she still paid some attention to them. His movements were natural and smooth, extremely coherent, and didn't seem like he was doing it randomly. As Lu Rui watched, she couldn't help but imitate a move. It seemed like something flashed through her mind, but when she thought about it carefully, there was nothing. After Li Yi finished the turning and stroking, he saw Lu Rui's beautiful starting hand, full of beauty. He was stunned for a moment and said, "My wife, do you want to learn Tai Chi? I can teach you." Lu Rui smiled and said, "My husband is busy all day, you don't have to worry about me. I have nothing to do anyway, and it is not difficult to learn." Li Yi waved his hand. When he practiced martial arts, he was ordered around by Lu Rui all day, and Lu Rui occasionally came to give him advice. It was not easy to get a chance to reverse. How could he let it go so easily? Tomorrow, he would ask Lu Rui if she wanted to learn it. At that time, he would definitely make things difficult for her, reprimand her, rotten wood cannot be carved, to save some face. Then I'll have to trouble you, my husband. Lu Rui smiled slightly. At this moment, she was a little curious about this method of borrowing strength to fight strength, and using little effort to achieve a great deal of wealth. After a moment, in the small courtyard, the conversation between the two gradually became more frequent. This movement is not like this. Tai Chi is in a circle. My wife, try to experience it. I understand, for this movement, you have to raise your hand a little higher. Yes, that's right. After a moment, the topic was changed by Li Yi. My wife, your martial arts are so powerful. Have you heard of the enlightenment method? What is enlightenment method? It is a martial arts master who, through a certain secret method, imparts his lifelong skills to another person, and the person who has imparted his skills will instantly become a peerless master. My husband, you must be joking again. Skills are not goods, how can they be imparted? My husband, you must have seen it in those strange novels again, right? Ah, there is no such method. Li Yi's voice sounded a little disappointed. Another hope of becoming a martial arts master was dashed again. Chapter 95. As for Lu Rui's speed of learning Tai Chi, Li Yi already didn't know what words to use to describe it. It was because he had a heaven-defying cheating device that he was able to master it in a very short period of time. However, Lu Rui only needed to be taught twice and corrected a few movements before she was able to execute a near-standard Taiji fist. Although there were still some flaws, she was beautiful and tall. More importantly, she had a strong martial arts foundation. The movements she executed were much better than Li Yi's. This made Li Yi, who was standing at the side, sigh in his heart. These movements were indeed different when done by a woman, whether it was practical or not, at least it looked extremely pleasing to the eye. Not long after, there was a knock on the door, which made Li Yi unable to enjoy it so peacefully. It didn't sound like Fong. The way he knocked on the door was much rougher than this. It also wasn't Lu Rui. When second miss came back, she never had to go through the trouble of knocking on the door. She could just fly in from outside. Li Yi walked over and opened the door. He saw two middle-aged men standing behind the door, their faces full of smiles. Seeing the two men, Li Yi was stunned for a moment. They looked familiar. He thought that he had seen them before. After thinking carefully, he remembered that it was last night. The two of them sent some eggs and mooncakes, and then he sent Xiao Huan away. As for their identity, it seemed that they were one of Lu's sister Rui's uncles. They belonged to the direct line of descent. Ever since the Lu clan settled down here, the two girls had quite a few uncles after a few generations of inheritance. It had to be said that the Lu family's ability to produce sons was not just for show. It was said that Lu Rui's grandfather had 5 brothers, and the 5 of them each had their own children, giving birth to a bunch of sons. They were Lu Rui and her sister's uncles. On the other hand, the direct line of descent was only passed down from Lu Rui's father's line. There were only 2 girls in the next generation. 4th uncle, 7th uncle, what's the matter? Although Lu Rui had never gotten along with these people, as juniors, she still had the necessary etiquette. Lu Rui walked over and bowed to the 2 of them. Let's talk inside, let's talk inside. Seeing that Li Yi and Lu Rui didn't seem to want to invite them in, the 2 of them laughed dryly. May I know why 4th uncle and 7th uncle have come this time? After a while, Lu Rui looked at the 2 of them and asked again. Most of these uncles weren't on good terms with her and her sister. Yesterday, the 2 of them had eagerly sent gifts over, which had already made her extremely surprised. Now that he had come to visit again, it seemed that he really did have something important to do. The 2 of them looked hesitant, but their eyes flashed with determination. They took out a few pieces of yellowed paper and placed them on the table in front of them. 4th uncle, what do you mean? Lu Rui looked at the things on the table and turned to look at him. Finally, a trace of doubt appeared in her beautiful eyes. When her father was still alive, the village was one, but when he had an accident, those uncles immediately wanted to separate from the family. The 2 sisters were still young at that time, and almost all the things that belonged to them were taken away. At that time, the other party didn't give them any face at all. Why did their temperament change now? The middle-aged man on the left said, Rui, what happened in the past was our fault. When we separated from the family, these land deeds should have belonged to you and Rui. You should accept them. 4th uncle, what do you want to say? Just say it. Of course, Lu Rui wouldn't think that they suddenly found their conscience and wanted to return the things that they had taken away. There must be a bigger plot for them to act like this. The middle-aged man hesitated for a while and said again, since Rui said so, I'll say it directly. You know, these 2 years have not been good, and life at home has been really hard. In a few days, I'm afraid it will be difficult for us to even eat. Look, the sugar-coated haws made by the son-in-law are so popular. Can we, at this point, the middle-aged man's meaning was already very clear. Although the sugar-coated haws business was good, people only recognized the loose sugar-coated haws sold by Fong and the others. The business of other vendors was still bleak and pitiful. If they also wanted to make a fortune by selling sugar-coated haws, even if they got the secret recipe, without their consent, they couldn't use the name of the Lus, and the profit would still be pitiful. If they could get their consent and start the sugar-coated haws business, then this land wouldn't be much at all. The land in the stockade wasn't considered good farmland to begin with. When the year was good, the production could more or less meet the needs of life. If it was a disaster year like last year, there was almost no harvest for the whole year, then what was the use of the land? If they had known that Rui would be able to snatch such a son-in-law in a few years, there would have been no separation of the family that year. They would have desperately fawned on the two sisters if they could. "Husband, you decide on this matter." Lu Rui didn't answer them. She turned her head and said to Li Yi. Regarding the sugar-coated haws, he had been the one doing it from beginning to end. Lu Rui had never asked, so naturally, she wouldn't make the decision for him at this time. In fact, Li Yi had already roughly understood the intentions of Lu Rui's uncles last night. The status of the Lu's sugar-coated haws in Qing and prefectural city was roughly equivalent to the old Beijing sugar-coated haws of later generations. It was a time-honored brand with guaranteed quality. They were only after this name. He turned to look at the two and smiled. "Fourth uncle. Seventh uncle, right?" "Ah." The two knew in their hearts that whether or not they could succeed today depended on the scholar in front of them. They hurriedly responded, and the smile on their faces became even more amiable. Li Yi's expression was hesitant. He revealed a thoughtful expression and said, "It's not impossible for you to use the Lu's name to sell sugar-coated haws, but what?" The two immediately asked. "But you can only do it in the form of an alliance," Li Yi said, looking at them. "What do you mean by an alliance?" The two looked at each other and asked Li Yi in confusion. Even Lu Rui's beautiful eyes showed a trace of doubt. It was clearly the first time she had heard of such a term. The meaning of an alliance is very simple. "We can agree to let you use the Lu's name to sell sugar-coated haws, but we will take half of the daily profits," Li Yi said, looking at them. The Lu's sugar-coated haws name was not so easy to spread. It was not very realistic to ask them to fork out a large sum of money in advance. Explaining the concept of an alliance to them in the future was also like playing the lute to a cow. They could only use this simple and crude method. 50%. The two of them exclaimed at the same time. This number, for them, was a little too much to bear. No one would be willing to give half of the hard-earned money to someone else. "Son-in-law, isn't 50% a little too much?" Fourth uncle of the Lus looked at Li Yi and asked with some difficulty. Li Yi smiled without saying anything, indicating that there was no room for discussion on this matter. "After bullying my wife and sister-in-law for so many years, it was time to pay back some interest. Let us think about this matter." Li Yi smiled as he watched the two of them walk out the door, waiting patiently. After a moment, the two of them walked back in. Fourth uncle thought for a moment, then said, 50% is really a little too much. We'll go back and think about it. I'll give you an answer tomorrow." He was obviously extremely unwilling to give half of the profits to others. After the discussion between the two of them just now, when they went back, they would join forces with the other direct family members to put pressure on them. It would be best if they could waive the alliance fee, but if that was not possible, it was not impossible to reduce it to half. After saying that, he turned around and walked out the door. "Rui, son-in-law, without your agreement, I won't be able to earn even 50%. 50%, then 50%. I agree." Fourth uncle of the Lus had one foot out the door when he heard the familiar voice of seventh uncle behind him. Bang! Fourth uncle of the Lus tripped on the doorsill, and his body flew forward half a foot before landing heavily on the ground, stirring up a cloud of dust. Fourth uncle, why are you so polite?" Not too far away from him, old Fong was standing there, looking at the scene before him with a look of astonishment on his face. Chapter 96. Fourth Uncle Lu left quickly and returned quickly as well. The fall on the doorstep seemed to have made him think things through. He climbed up and patted the dust off his body as if nothing had happened. He readily agreed. He had already thought it through. He was also willing to pay the 50% of the adjoining fee. Of course, how the other person secretly cursed seventh uncle for being a treacherous pig-like teammate was not something that Li Yi cared about. The candied Ha's business wasn't big, but it wasn't small either. Fong and the others had more important things to do, so they naturally couldn't spend all their time on this. They urgently lacked manpower. This was the first problem they had to face if they wanted to expand the candied Ha's business. The demand for the Lu family's candied Ha's in Qing and prefectural city was far from being saturated. There was still a lot of profit to be made. Of course, Li Yi couldn't just give this portion of the profit to the Lu family's direct descendants. It wasn't impossible for them to interfere, but if he didn't peel off a few layers of skin from them, how could he be worthy of the care these people had given the Lu sisters all these years? Son-in-law, do you really plan on letting them do the candied Ha's business? Fong walked in from outside and looked at Li Yi with a face full of confusion. For Fong, this was currently the only profitable business. Naturally, he wasn't willing to let the direct descendants take advantage of it for nothing. He had personally witnessed how these people treated the two ladies these past few years. Fong didn't even want to give them 10% of the profit, let alone 50%. You have to look at the long term. Just think of it as them making money for us. Li Yi could only think of another way to explain things to Fong, who only knew how to look at things in front of him. Although it wasn't easy for Fong's brain to work around things, his intelligence was still within the range of a normal person. After hearing Li Yi's explanation, he somewhat understood. Just letting them borrow the Lu family's candied Ha's name and they could get 50% of the profit for nothing. Thinking about it this way, it didn't seem like a loss. Thinking of this, Fong's face showed his signature silly smile. Looking at the silly smile on Fong's face, Li Yi couldn't help but think of the scene last night when this guy tricked him. He resisted the urge to take off his shoes and slap his face. He smiled and said, "Don't smile like an idiot. Come in, I have something to tell you." For some reason, Fong's heart trembled when he saw the smile on Li Yi's face. He suddenly had a bad premonition. After an hour, Fong walked out of the courtyard with a worried look on his face. He looked back at the house and let out a long sigh. The son-in-law actually handed the task of building a workshop to him and wanted it to be completed within 5 days. If he did it well, there would be no reward. If he didn't do it well, his bonus of half a month of candied Ha's would be deducted. Fong was extremely suspicious in his heart. This was definitely the son-in-law's revenge for what he did last night. He didn't want to take this hot potato, but he thought that if he didn't let the son-in-law vent his anger, he was afraid that he wouldn't be able to sleep well every night. Sooner or later, there would be a knife. This time, it was better to take it happily, if he had known that retribution would come so quickly, last night. Alas, he regretted it so much. He sighed all the way back and saw a figure pacing back and forth in front of the door from a distance. It was a thin man, pacing back and forth while rubbing his hands. From time to time, he glanced into the courtyard, but he didn't take a step in. "Yang Xiaojun, what are you doing here?" Fong walked over with large strides and looked at the man. His face turned cold as he asked coldly. "Fong, I..." The man suddenly heard a voice behind him and turned to look at Fong. A trace of shame appeared on his face. After a long time, he opened his mouth and said with some difficulty, I came to borrow some food from you. There hasn't been any food at home for 2 days. It doesn't matter if I don't have enough to eat, but the child." Fong's face was rarely gloomy. There was an irrepressible anger in his eyes as he looked at the man. When Rui's father was still alive, this man was like himself and the others. He was also by the side of the direct line of descent. They grew up together and were considered the closest brothers. However, ever since the old stockade master left, only Fong and a few others stayed. The man and most of the others chose to get close to the direct line of descent. From then on, Fong and him did not have any contact. Even when they met in the stockade and the man wanted to greet him, Fong would just coldly walk past him. Being betrayed by his best brother was a knot that had been stuck in Fong's heart for all these years. I've let you two ladies down for what happened back then. I've let you down. You can beat me up, but I'm begging you to lend me some food. Otherwise, the child will really starve to death. The shame on the man's face deepened. He was a famous man. Even if he had to starve to death, he wouldn't have been able to lower himself to look for Fong. However, there was still a child at home who hadn't eaten for 2 days. Fong's expression was still cold. Even though he knew that the man had been driven into a corner and had no choice but to leave in order to feed his family, there was always a thorn in his heart. Even now, he could not forgive him. Seeing that Fong did not speak for a long time, a hint of defeat finally appeared on the man's face. A look of despair appeared in his eyes as he turned around and walked away without saying a word. He would rather starve to death than beg for help. This was indeed his limit. After taking 2 steps, an angry shout came from behind him. Yang Xiaojun, you mother of cur, stop right there. Turning his head, a huge fist came flying at him and smashed fiercely into his face. At the same time, Fong's furious voice came, you be *starred, I've wanted to beat you up for a long time. After being punched in the face, the man immediately felt dizzy and saw stars. He was also angered and returned a punch as he cursed, come on, I'm not afraid of you. Old Fong hadn't expected his opponent to fight back, and was caught off guard. The fist landed on his face, causing his eyes to swell like a panda's. Cursing angrily, he punched back and began to wrestle with the man. The two of them punched and kicked each other. After all, the man's physique was much inferior to Fong's. Although he was not suppressed and beaten, he was still the one at a disadvantage. After being kicked to the ground by Fong for an unknown number of times, he lay there panting and was unwilling to get up again. The last time I beat you up so happily was probably more than 10 years ago, right? Old Fong wiped the sweat off his forehead. Although his face was covered in bruises, there was a comfortable expression on his face. Yes, it's been more than 10 years. The man looked up at the sky as a trace of reminiscence appeared on his face. The reminiscence flashed on Fong's face, and then he kicked the man and said coldly, if you're not dead, come in with me. After a while, Fong stuffed a large bag of refined rice into the man's hand and scolded, this food is for my nephew. It has nothing to do with you, Yang Xiaojun. Fong, The bag of rice seemed to be at least 12 kilograms. A trace of emotion appeared on the man's face. Just as he was about to speak, he was interrupted by Fong with a wave of his hand. These days, the son-in-law is going to build a workshop. If you have nothing to do, come and work with me. You'll get 10 copper coins a day, and you'll eat your fill. Don't say that I, Fong, treat you badly. Fong punched him in the chest and said, and those bastards, if they're willing to come and work with me, let them come. Thank you. The man was stunned when he heard the words, and then his face showed ecstasy. He only said half a sentence, and Fong waved his hand and said, okay, go home quickly. Don't let your mother-in-law wait. If you're willing to work, come and find me after dinner. Son-in-law, I've found everyone. Li Yi was planning how the floral water workshop should be built in the room. Fong pushed the door and said at the top of his voice. So fast, hiss, you are. Li Yi raised his head and looked at Fong's bruised and swollen face. He took a breath and couldn't help but ask, did you really go to a brothel last night and was discovered by your mother-in-law today? Chapter 97. Li Yi did not doubt whether Fong had visited the brothel last night. It was not because he believed in his character, but because he did not have that much money. Although the candied Ha's business brought in money every day, with Fong's current savings, it was not enough for him to visit a brothel. That kind of brothel was a place where the rich went. Fong's wife was in charge of the money, and it was good enough that she could give him a few dozen copper coins as pocket money. If he went to that kind of place, he might not even be able to afford the cheapest girl. However, although Fong looked a little embarrassed, he seemed to be in a good mood, so Li Yi did not continue to ask. If this was the daily hobby of the couple in the bedroom, it would be a little awkward for an outsider to ask. The construction of the workshop was left to Fong and the others. These men were all experts in many aspects. They were good at farming, herding horses, building walls, and fighting. Except for some things that needed to be told in advance, Li Yi did not need to worry about it. As for the location of the workshop, after a round of inspection by Li Yi and Fong, they had more or less decided on it. Considering safety and confidentiality, of course, the workshop could not be built in the stockade village. Using the distillation method to purify alcohol required open fire, and alcohol was flammable. If something happened and the stockade village was set on fire, it would be very lively. Of course, confidentiality was also a big part of the reason. Whether it was the production of ruidu or the distillation of alcohol, there was not much technical difficulty. If the confidentiality was not done well, and someone learned it secretly and spread it, then naturally, these two things could not be used to make money. Considering the transportation, water source, and many other factors, the location of the workshop was finally chosen to be outside the stockade village, next to a stream near the back mountain. The stream was not big, and there had never been a mountain flood for decades. It was convenient to get water, and it was very safe. He gave the finished drawing to Fong. He only needed to go and look at it every day, and he did not need to worry about other things. As a man who majored in engineering, although he did not specialize in civil engineering or architecture, things like drawing couldn't be more simple for Li Yi. The blueprint of the workshop was based on the workshop of the future. Only some minor changes were made according to the actual situation. There were only a few drawings, some flat, some three-dimensional, and some simple lines, but they clearly expressed the structure of the workshop. It was clear at a glance. Fong and the others only needed to build according to the drawings. Of course, before that, he had to first rent a shop in the prefecture city. Originally, he had only planned to rent a normal shop, but after winning against Xinjiao yesterday, he had gained 300 taels of liquid capital, so he had to change his plans. 300 taels of silver was enough to rent a shop with a good location in a bustling area. Originally, he planned to go down the mountain to rent a shop and renovate it over the next few days. Then, he would take out some Rui nectar to test the market. After the workshop was built, he would be able to mass produce it. However, changes often came a little faster than planned. Many people in the village were eyeing the candied Ha's business. In the past, it was not easy for the direct descendants of the Liu family to ask for it. Of course, they also knew that even if they asked for it, Fong Laosan and the others would not agree. However, the success of Fong Laosan and Fong Laosan made them widen their eyes. Just by handing over 2 land deeds, they could sell candied Ha's in the name of the Liu family. Although the adjoining fee of 50% made their hearts ache when they thought about it, as long as they could succeed in the candied Ha's business, even if they had to hand over 50% of the profits, they could still live a much better life than what they had now. No matter how they looked at it, it was a good deal. Land was the foundation of a family. Under normal circumstances, they would not easily hand over the land. However, how much food could the land produce in a year? Usually, it was fine, and the family could always eat their fill. If the harvest was bad one year, the whole family would have to tighten their waistbands to live. Looking at Fong Laosan and the others, they had only been with Rui's son-in-law for a short time. What kind of life were they living now? How could the direct descendants feel at ease? As a result, in the past 2 days, Li Yi's house was almost trampled to the ground by these people. Land deeds, joining fee. They had already gotten the information they wanted from Fong Laosan and Fong Laosan. These people were very straightforward. They slapped the land deeds on the table one by one. Before Li Yi mentioned the joining fee, they took the initiative to make an agreement. 50% was 50%. Everyone would get 50%, and no one would lose out. From the beginning to the end, these uncles' attitudes were very humble. The smiles on their faces were as kind as they could be. After all, no one wanted to go against money. What kind of life they would lead in the future was completely up to Li Yi's decision. Lu Rui did not ask about what Li Yi had done. She only silently put away the land deeds that Li Yi had handed over to her. However, Xiao Huan's pretty face was full of smiles these days. After being bullied for a long time by those people, she was very happy to see them talking to the son-in-law with a smile. To be honest, Li Yi was not interested in the land. In this era, as long as one wanted money, it was a very simple thing to buy land. Moreover, the land here was not like the land in the future, where the right to use it was only for a few decades. Even if the dynasty changed, it would only recognize the deed and not the owner. If it was your land, it would be your land. In order to maintain stability, the ruler would not take back the land. As long as you had the land deed, you were still the owner of the land, and no one could take it away. The barren land of Willow Leaves Village was really not attractive to Li Yi. He just wanted to take back what should belong to them. The real reason why he asked the direct descendants of Luz to intervene in the business of candied haws was that Fong and the others should always leave some soup for others to drink. Under his wise leadership, Fong and the others would only get better and better in the future. Even if Fong wanted to live in a big house and marry a concubine, it was not impossible. There was no harm if there was no comparison. A few people were living a well-off life, but most people in the village were still hovering above the line of food and clothing. The gap between the rich and the poor was so big. If it went on like this, there would be trouble sooner or later. But now, such a hidden danger had been extinguished by Li Yi before it even had a chance to show itself. Of course, it only solved the problem of the direct descendants of Luz. After all, most of the people in the village were the former bandits like Fong and the others. Their lives were even more difficult. However, for these people, being able to fill the stomachs of their families was already the greatest satisfaction they could get. This request was not too high. Even if Li Yi did not mention it, old Fong and the others would also think of helping out on a daily basis, so there would not be any major problems. Chapter 98. Brother, may I know where the nearest broker house is? On the busy street of Qing and Prefecture, the handsome scholar stopped a passing man. He cupped his hands in obeisance and said with a smile. The man cupped his hands in obeisance and said with a smile, "Go straight ahead for about half a mile, cross a street, and then turn left. After crossing 2 streets, you will see a marketplace." "Is the broker house in the marketplace?" The handsome scholar looked at him and asked. No. There are many people in the marketplace." "Brother, you can ask someone there. Someone should know where the broker house is." The man smiled and turned away with a calm face. Looking at the back of the man leaving, Li Yi forced a smile on his face and felt like thousands of horses were galloping in his heart. He was not in a hurry to ask the broker. He was a little tired after walking all the way down the mountain. He rested for a while at a tea stall on the side of the street, wondering if he should buy a carriage. The distance between Willow Leaf Village and Qing and Prefectural City was more than 20 miles. If he only relied on walking, it would take him more than 2 hours to get there. However, it seemed that it was useless to buy a carriage. Some mountain roads were rugged and inconvenient, so a carriage couldn't pass. No wonder Willow Village was so poor before he came. They didn't even understand the principle of, to get rich, build roads first. They guarded a few acres of barren land and lived in isolation for decades. It would be strange if they could get rich. After drinking a cup of tea to quench his thirst, he asked the tea stall owner. He didn't expect that the owner really knew where the broker house was and enthusiastically pointed out the direction for Li Yi. The broker house in this era was equivalent to the 58 cities in the future. Renting houses, buying and selling maids and servants were all within the scope of the business of the broker house. In the broker house, there was no need to worry about encountering illegal agents, because all the brokers were registered by the government and had a certificate. Once someone complained about them, they would be sued. According to the tea stall owner's guidance, Li Yi soon found the broker house. As soon as he entered the gate, several people surrounded him. "Master, do you want to rent a house or buy maids? Master, I grew up in the prefecture and am very familiar with this place. No matter what you want, I'm sure you will be satisfied. Master, the guys in the broker house were all very enthusiastic. This scene was a little similar to the time when Li Xian took him to the brothel last time. However, it was no wonder that they were so enthusiastic. In this line of work, how much they earned depended entirely on their performance. If a customer wanted to inquire about something here, they had to pay a certain fee. Their wages came from this fee, and the more customers they attracted, the more their commission would naturally be. If they met a generous person, as long as the customer was satisfied, they would naturally reward them with money. The young master in front of them looked extraordinary, so he must be a big customer. These middlemen had dealt with all kinds of people all year round, so they were quite good at judging people. Li Yi casually picked a smart-looking guy. The others couldn't help but show disappointment on their faces, but they could only retreat helplessly. Young master, what do you need? Don't hesitate to tell me. I will definitely satisfy you. The waiter rubbed his hands together and said with a smile. I need to rent a shop in the prefecture, a moderate size, preferably in a bustling area. How about the rent here? Li Yi didn't beat around the bush and said straightforwardly. The waiter was obviously very familiar with this. He said without thinking, if it's in an ordinary area, the rent of an ordinary shop is about 100 taels. If you want to rent a shop in a bustling area, I'm afraid it will cost at least 300 taels of silver. This price was not much different from what Li Yi had expected. However, 300 taels of silver was not a small number after all. After the shop was rented, it would definitely need to be renovated, which would cost at least dozens of taels of silver. In this way, there would not be enough money to buy the raw materials for making ruidu. 300 taels of silver is a little expensive. Li Yi smiled, took out a piece of broken silver from his arms, and put it on the table in front of the waiter. The broken silver was at least 1 tael. Seeing this, the waiter's eyes suddenly lit up. He swept his sleeve across the table and the silver disappeared. When he looked at Li Yi again, the smile on his face became even more radiant. Young master, you have found the right person this time. I just happen to know of a shop in a bustling area that is urgently for sale. The price is about 20% lower than the market price. If young master is interested, I will take you there immediately. Reality proved that money could make the devil turn millstones. This saying had been used since ancient times. Most things in the world could be solved with money. If it couldn't, then it meant that the money you gave was not enough. 1 tael of silver was enough to make the waiter's attitude become extremely enthusiastic. He immediately took Li Yi to see the shop. The location of the shop was not bad. It was on the main street of the Qing and prefecture. Outside was the busy street. The shop was about 3 feet long and 6 feet wide. It could be considered spacious. More importantly, there was a small courtyard and 2 rooms at the back of the shop. According to the waiter, the family that originally did business here moved to the capital after their business became big, and the shop was left empty. However, this shop was located in the bustling area of the prefecture. If it was left empty, it would be too much of a waste. Therefore, they asked the broker to rent it out for them. Because they left in a hurry, the rent was much lower. As for the courtyard and rooms at the back of the shop, they were also given to them for free. After looking at the shop and the courtyard behind it, Li Yi started to feel uneasy. To be able to rent such a place for less than 300 taels of silver, it was almost no different from a pie falling from the sky. He looked at the waiter with some suspicion and asked, "Tell me honestly, is there something wrong with this shop? Was there a murder case, or was there a ghost?" Hearing this, the waiter was stunned at first, and then he said with a bitter smile, "Young master, you have wronged me. Everything I said is true, without any concealment. If you don't believe me, you can ask around." At this moment, the waiter felt bitter in his heart. 1 tael of silver was almost equivalent to a month's salary. If it wasn't for the fact that this young master had been so generous, he definitely wouldn't have mentioned such a good thing so easily. Forget it, forget it. Li Yi waved his hand. If there was really a problem here, the broker would not take such a hot potato. Moreover, one should be upright and not suspect others for no reason. At this time, a stout fat man came out from the cloth shop next door. Seeing this, Li Yi hurried to go up. May I know your name? Are you the shopkeeper of this cloth shop? The fat man nodded and looked at Li Yi with doubt. My surname is Su. What can I do for you? Shopkeeper Su has been here for a long time. Have you heard that the shop next door is haunted? The waiter just walked out of the shop and heard this. He couldn't help but stagger and almost fell. You're tuning into the Journey of the Soul YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.